The town of Mainwich, shrouded in the mist of night, seemed unchanged in its tranquility. The stars were visible in the sky, and the sound of the leaves on the trees was the only music that broke the silence. However, that stillness was about to disappear due to all the darkness that was heading towards the place. The story begins with John, a man who lived in a house in the outskirts of town, with his wife Sarah and their little son Ethan. The family had chosen Mainwich to escape the hassle and bustle of the city and enjoy a quiet life. But the last few weeks had seen an unsettling change in their home. Sarah had begun to show strange symptoms of discomfort. Her skin had paled, her once radiant eyes were dull, and her voice had lost its sweetness. John, worried about his wife's health, insisted she go to the town doctor. However, each visit to the clinic seemed pointless, as the doctor found nothing out of the ordinary, and defined the symptoms as simple temporary ailments. The man's concern became an obsession as Sarah experienced even greater changes. She began to lose weight rapidly and her appetite completely faded. When they were in bed, nightmares took over, and her eyes filled with terror as she was trapped in terrible dreams. One night, while Sarah was still sleeping in bed, John couldn't help but inspect her abdomen. Carefully, he lifted her pajama top and examined her belly. What he found took his breath away. A strange, hard lump, as if something was growing under her skin. His thoughts were filled with fear and confusion as he observed the mysterious deformity on his wife's body. Would it be cancer? That had to be a tumor, and the worst thing is that it didn't look benign, quite the opposite. Determined to understand what was happening, he began searching the internet for answers. After going through several oncology pages, the description of the symptoms ended up taking him to forums, where several people described the same symptoms in one of their relatives. Nobody offered them help or found a solution. Everything seemed to indicate that they were facing a new unknown disease. The following day, Sarah's little appetite disappeared and a voracious hunger awoke in her. She didn't stop eating. She ate and ate, but nothing satisfied her. She spent the day hungry, and he became frustrated at not being able to fill the emptiness she felt. Fear gripped John more and more as he watched helplessly as Sarah's health deteriorated. The lump in her abdomen continued to grow. They sought help from doctors and specialists in nearby hospitals, but none could offer an explanation for the strange symptoms. The husband's concern reached its peak when one night, while lying next to his wife, he felt something move in her belly. He watched in shock as a lump emerged from Sarah's skin, as if something was trying to force its way from inside. Pregnant? No way! That could not be a baby. He quickly phoned his childhood best friend Emily, who worked as a microbiologist. She was his only hope of discovering the truth behind his wife's transformation. He apologized for disturbing her at that time of night and assured her that he was desperate. Emily, on the other side, was changing her pajamas into jeans and a t-shirt, assuring him that she would leave immediately. In a few hours, she would be in his home. When Emily arrived, she did so in a special waterproof suit. Her body was protected from top to bottom with a type of diver like that of an astronaut, with gloves, boots, hood, mask, and protective glasses. She gave her friend a pair of kids just like hers for him and his son, and asked him to put the little boy in the car. Emily seemed not to be surprised. She showed that she knew what she was facing. John did everything his friend asked. He got dressed, took his little boy out of bed and locked him in the car, assuring him that his mother had a very contagious virus and that he should wait there so they wouldn't all get sick. Afterwards, he returned to his friend. She asked him to stay outside because if that was what she believed, it was going to be something very shocking. She had already called the infectious diseases service, and in no time all the scientific staff would arrive. He asked her for answers. What virus did his wife have? Was he also infected? She looked at him very seriously and said, "This is not a virus, John. It's something much worse. I can't tell you anything. The government wouldn't allow it." He understood less and less. What did the government have to do with all of that? There were normal, ordinary people who lived in the countryside. They didn't even socialize with more than 4 neighbors. They spent their days among enormous plantations and orchards that they themselves took care of. Emily, protected by her biosafety suit, cautiously entered the room where Sarah was sleeping. The first thing she did was inject her with a sedative to make sure she wouldn't wake up and get up. A few minutes later, the infectious disease security services rang at the door, all dressed in their protective suits. They greeted John and he guided them to the room where Emily and his wife were waiting for them. He stayed outside. They did not allow him to stay inside. However, thanks to the fact that they had not left the door completely closed, he was able to see what they were doing through a small space. Unable to understand the situation, his mind was filled with questions and he feared for his wife's safety. Emily examined Sarah carefully. The bulge on her abdomen was clearly visible under the skin. With a worried look and with the approval of the other health workers, Emily took samples of the strange lump and performed preliminary tests on the spot, trying to obtain any clue that could confirm what was happening. Sarah, although unconscious, showed signs of a profound and disturbing transformation. Something was taking control of her body from within. Finally, Emily left the room and approached John, who was eagerly wanting to know what was happening. She explained the seriousness of the situation and how his wife was being consumed. Emily was scared, and her words echoed in John's mind. For several months, they had been obtaining samples of people infected with something they believed to be parasites. At first, they thought it was something similar to worms, like tapeworm, and that they lived in the digestive system of people, feeding on what they ate and creating such exaggerated hunger and extreme thinness. But from the latest studies, they were quite wrong. State intelligence, together with NASA, had detected the infiltration of alien beings. They were quite small in size, similar to 1 or 2-year-old children. To take control of the Earth, they had begun to enter the bodies of various human beings and consume their lives. Through what they ate, their organism became stronger, and little by little, the person who had become a guest lost the will of their actions and feelings until they ended up completely empty. All his intelligence and energy was absorbed by the creature, managing to reproduce. And once it had completed its mission in that body, it left it through the abdomen and entered the body of another person to begin a new reproduction process. John was horrified by the story he was hearing, but something inside him told him that Emily was right. The strange bulge in Sarah's abdomen and her increasingly strange behavior seemed to fit the description of those aliens. "What can we do to stop this?" John asked. Emily sighed deeply. "I don't know, John. We haven't found an effective way to combat these beings. They're highly aggressive and apparently reproduce inside human bodies before moving on to others. What is clear is that we cannot allow this to continue." The specialists finished their examinations and left the room. They turned to John and Emily to inform them that they needed to take Sarah to a high-security facility for further investigation. The husband, despite his concern, nodded. The group of specialists took Sarah to the laboratory, where they continued their test in a controlled environment. The room was surrounded by thick glass that allowed one to observe the interior without risk of a contagion. John looked worriedly at his wife as doctors put her through a series of tests and scans. He begged them to let him in. He needed to be with his wife at all times, but they refused due to the high danger. Finally, after much insistence, they gave in to letting him see the entire procedure through the windows. There he would be safe. John, anxious and desperate, looked through the glass with his heart in his hand as Sarah lay unconscious on the stretcher. One of the specialists grabbed a scalpel and proceeded to make an opening in the woman's abdomen. Suddenly, a scream echoed through the room as one of the doctors staggered and fell to the floor. Surprise and chaos took over the place while the others tried to help their partner. Everything began to fill with blood and John couldn't know what was happening. He pounded on the glass frantically. "Let me in! What's going on with my wife?" Suddenly, he could see it, and what he saw through the glass took his breath away. Two horrible creatures writhed and emerged from Sarah's abdomen. Emily arrived just at that moment and grabbed her friend while also observing in shock and terror what was happening in the room. The doctors in the examination room were struggling to remain calm as they tried to contain the situation. But before they could react, the creatures emerged with frightening violence. The two aliens, grotesque and disgusting looking, broke free from Sarah's body. They had bulbous heads and dark, beady eyes. Their limbs were long and thin, and their bodies were covered in a slimy substance. They attacked the doctors nearby, tearing their groans and scratching their bodies. Horror unleashed in the laboratory as the specialist screamed in panic and pain. The creatures entered the bodies of two of them. John was paralyzed with fear as he watched the men being invaded and controlled by those alien creatures. The other doctors headed to the door to try to escape. But then, Emily reacted urgently and touched the button that locked the doors, preventing them from leaving. The doctors looked at them through the glass, imploring them to let them out. While their two companions contracted on the floor and the creatures devoured them from the inside and took control of their entire bodies. Everything had been filled with blood and screams, but John could only see his wife's open, bleeding body on the stretcher. The vital signs were no longer showing on the screen. She had died. Those creatures had stolen the most valuable thing in his life. Emily grabbed John and dragged him toward the exit. "We have to get out of here now," she exclaimed. "We can't do anything for them. We must escape before it's too late for us too." They ran out of the laboratory and alerted their security guards about the situation inside. The door was sealed and alarms echoed in the hallway. The reproduction of those aliens was multiplying, and Emily knew that they had to find a way to stop it before it was too late. John was in shock, unable to fully process what he had witnessed, but something made him continue forward. He had to help his son. So the first thing they did was go out of the car to look for the little one, and with him in their arms, they returned to the center to find answers. They headed to the central control room. As they examined the records and collected samples, Emily explained more details about the alien invasion to John. A couple of months ago, she had met with Dr. Marcus Reynolds, a renowned ufologist and retired NASA scientist. He shared his strange findings with her. He had been investigating several UFO sightings and reports of unexplained disappearance of people in the region. He had discovered that incidents had increased in recent weeks. His inquiries had taken him to an abandoned cabin on the outskirts where he found evidence that something or someone had been worshipping those aliens for generations. On the walls were carvings and symbols that told the story of the aliens' arrival on Earth and their purpose to replace humanity. The discovery of the abandoned cabin left Dr. Reynolds speechless. The symbols revealed a terrifying story. These aliens had been stalking humanity for generations, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves and take control. Determined to face that threat, the doctor continued his research. To discover more, he established a kind of hidden camp on the outskirts, waiting for an opportunity to confront those beings. One night, while observing the starry sky, he saw a series of blinking lights in formation. A fleet of alien ships slowly descending towards the town. The last thing Emily knew about the doctor was that he was going to notify the government and NASA what was happening. After that, she lost communication with him. Either the aliens had overpowered him, or the government had gotten him out of the way before chaos reigned throughout the population. As Emily continued to review the samples, she told John that although she didn't have enough evidence, she believed that these aliens were vulnerable to certain types of ultraviolet radiation, similar to solar radiation, but in much higher concentrations. In the tests she had performed in her laboratory, she had obtained results where the cells had weakened. The key was finding a way to apply that radiation effectively. They left the control room and headed to the scientific equipment warehouse. While searching, they encountered a group of investigators who had heard the emergency alarm and were looking for an exit. Emily explained the situation and her plan to stop the creatures. Together, they searched for the necessary equipment and gathered it into a cart. Once they had everything they needed, they headed to the area where the creatures were. When they arrived at the sealed laboratory, they saw that the beings had multiplied, leaving all the doctors unconscious. Emily and John entered with the special protective equipment, activated the ultraviolet radiation devices, and began exposing the creatures to the intense light. The aliens reacted with pain and began to weaken, but they weren't going to give up easily. They tried to attack Emily and John, but the two stood their ground, holding the devices. As they fought, Emily noticed that the creatures were especially vulnerable when outside their host bodies. So they guided the radiation devices directly to the doctors to force the creatures out. Once all those beings were weak, the rest of the scientists entered and placed them in glass containers. Emily and John had stopped the alien invasion, at least for now, because they were sure that there were more people with those creatures inside them. The entire town was facing an unknown threat that lurked in every corner. Young people, children, old people, no one was safe. No one could know if their family member or friend was the host of that terror until it was too late. The fight against the alien invasion was far from over, but Emily and John, with the help of scientists and authorities, were determined to find a way to completely eradicate the creatures and protect all their families. Together, they would face an enemy that had been lurking in the shadows for generations, hoping to save the entire world from alien domination. Alfred and Holly were at the police station when their boss left 2 big boxes on their desk. There, they would find the documentation to solve a new case. The detective opened the boxes and looked inside. One box had a lot of documents as well as a journal. The other one was filled with DVDs, photos, and other pieces of evidence which were already taken to the lab and came with their corresponding results. Among the samples were what seemed to be strands of hair, as well as chunks of human skin and flesh. Alfred immediately knew he would be working on one of the most gruesome cases of that year. It was already late, so he decided to take the boxes home and check out their contents more calmly. He said goodbye to Holly and got in his car. When he arrived home, he left the boxes at the entrance and went directly to take a shower. It had been a pretty busy day, and Alfred needed to clear his mind before checking out all the items in the boxes. After showering and having dinner, he emptied the contents of the boxes on his living room table. He saw photographs of different crime scenes and noticed it wasn't a single murder, but 5. He organized the photos by date and saw that all of the bodies had something in common. It's as if someone had tried to eat them. It was very likely they were dealing with a real live cannibal. Alfred started to gag and couldn't avoid rushing to the bathroom to throw up. Despite being one of the most experienced detectives in the area, those pictures really impacted him. But he had no choice. People were still being murdered, and that specific case had been assigned to him. He grabbed one of the photographs and started to examine it. It was a 35-year-old woman. He could only know that thanks to the info card next to the photo, since all that was left of her was a completely mutilated body. Chunks of flesh had been torn out from her and were spread all over her bed. The bed sheets were soaked in blood. Her chest was destroyed, her ribs broken, and her heart had been removed. Her eyes were torn out as well, and some of her fingers were missing. Alfred could barely stand looking at those photos without throwing up again. He decided to put them aside and started reading the journal found at the house of that very victim. In that journal, the woman wrote something on the last page. "I'm still very scared. I don't know how much longer I can endure this. I know that something is observing me. He opens the doors and windows while I'm asleep. I have no peace. I can't stand this anymore. I can't even eat. I went to the police to report him, but they ignored me. They treated me like I'm crazy when all I want is for him to leave me alone." The pages of the journal were blood-stained, as if the victim had been killed right when she was writing. They found the book near her bed next to her corpse. Alfred then read the previous entries in the journal, and all of them talked about the killer. Her words were filled with fear and anxiety. The victim had been tormented for several days. Alfred read the journal from the newest to the oldest entry until he reached the first day when the young woman noticed something strange was happening in her house. "My window is still opening on its own at night. It's so strange. I close it perfectly when I go to sleep, but when I wake up, it's open again. It might be just an animal though. Maybe it's a squirrel that climbs up the tree outside my house. Tonight, I'll leave a camera filming my window, and then I'll try to catch that squirrel." After those words, the next pages in the journal started getting filled with fear and panic. After filming her window that night, the lady was horrified. Who or what did she see? And why didn't anybody help her? Alfred was especially shocked by that case, so he decided it was best to just go to bed for the time being. His head was saturated and he wasn't thinking clearly. He would check out all the items the next morning with his co-worker. The next day, Alfred arrived early at the office, but Holly was already there, waiting for him. Alfred turned on the thermostat and prepared 2 coffees. She asked him about the case. He sighed quietly and opened the boxes to take out the photos of the murders. Holly closed her eyes for a few seconds and gulped. She wondered how anybody could do something so atrocious. Alfred then started to reread the journal entries. First, the day the window started to open on its own, and then next day's entry where she started to panic. His first hypothesis was that a former romantic partner was tormenting her, that he was watching her every night and was breaking into her house. What didn't make sense is how could there be 4 more victims as well? Throughout the day, they kept on reading the documents and checking the images. All of them were so grotesque that they could barely look at them. After checking the samples picked up from the crime scenes, they remembered that they hadn't checked the contents of the DVDs yet. It was pretty late, so Alfred proposed that he would watch them that night and would bring a report for Holly the next day. When Alfred got home, he put on the DVDs in his DVD player to watch it on his TV and sat on his sofa. He was surprised to see that it contained the videos filmed by the same woman with the journal. At first, nothing was happening. All he could see was her shadow on her bed, writing on a notebook that was probably the journal now in his possession. She then got into her bed sheets and fell asleep. The detective sped up the playback of the first hours of the video and stopped when he noticed a different movement. It looked as if someone was climbing the tree next to the window. All he could see was a dark, immobile silhouette on a tree branch. Alfred needed to see that shadow more closely. He ejected the DVD out of his DVD player and put it in his computer's DVD drive. There, he had a specialized software to better analyze those kinds of images. He zoomed into the figure but couldn't distinguish it clearly, but it seemed to be a man. The figure stayed on a tree branch for hours, observing the young lady's room until it was almost dawn. And in that moment, the figure jumped from the tree, making noise and waking up the victim. The detective looked down for a few minutes, pondering, until his stomach reminded him that he hadn't eaten anything the entire day. Thus, he decided to take a break to make dinner. Alfred prepared a couple of steaks with potatoes, and with his stomach full, he went back to the computer and was startled to see that his window was open. He didn't remember opening it. Tried to ignore it, but after watching the victim's video, he started to get nervous. Alfred started to believe that the murderer found out that he had that video footage and that the killer was now coming to get him. His mind started racing with those thoughts, making him feel more and more paranoid. However, he tried to remain calm, closed the window, and kept watching the DVDs. The video of the second night started in the same way. However, the victim placed a candle next to the window, likely to better distinguish who was there, although it wasn't very effective. The lady started writing in her journal again, and when she finished, she left it on her nightstand. She then got into her bed sheets and fell asleep. After a few hours of filming, the murderer appeared at the window again. In that moment, Alfred thought he heard a voice, so he turned up the volume of his headphones to the max and confirmed that the sound was coming from the shadowy man. The man seemed to be muttering something, but Alfred couldn't distinguish what it was. He rechecked the victim's report to see if anyone had identified that voice. However, he found another document that caught his attention even more: the arrest of the young woman's cousin the night of her murder for being the prime suspect. Agents indicated that he called the police pleading for help, declaring that he couldn't get into the lady's room. However, when the police arrived, they found him in her bedroom next to her corpse. During the interrogation, the cousin said that the young woman told him that someone was watching her at night, and that she asked the police for help but that they didn't send anyone to patrol her house. And so the cousin decided to spend the night with her. However, on the night of the murder, when he heard the screams of his cousin, something was blocking the door and he couldn't save her. It was only when the murder had taken place that the door got unblocked and he could get in. But it was too late. For the very first moment, the cousin was considered the prime suspect since they found him on his knees next to the young lady's corpse. After checking the video footage, he was actually released, but his behavior completely changed. He was diagnosed with severe mental damage, refused to cooperate with the rest of the investigation, and was interned into a psychiatric hospital. And just a few days later, he became the second victim of that murder. Alfred checked the photos of the next crime, and in them he could see the cousin completely quartered. The killer had followed the same patterns: chunks of flesh torn out, no heart, no eyes. It was very likely that all of the victims were connected. It could be that during each murder there was a witness and the killer wanted to end everyone who could report him. However, it was too soon to jump into conclusions. He started checking the third DVD. The video started with the young lady making sure her window was well closed and leaving another lit candle there. Soon after, her cousin came into the room and gave her a hug. He told her that he would sleep in the next room and asked her to scream if she saw anybody at her window. The young woman then got into bed, looked towards the window, and wrote on her journal for the last time. The detective sped up the playback to reach the moment when the murderer appeared. He kept watching the video, but nothing was happening, until he soon noticed something different and paused the video. Alfred was shaken and his hands were sweating. He was about to witness a horrible scene. The window slowly opened and the shadowy figure got in. He went to the door and blocked it with something. Then he went towards the victim's bed, dragging his feet. He looked at the camera for a few seconds, but the room was way too dark to distinguish his face well. Then the figure slowly leaned towards the lady and muttered something in a quiet but threatening voice. Alfred couldn't understand him. He raised her hair, smelling it thoroughly. That's when she woke up and started screaming. After a few seconds, Alfred could hear how somebody was hitting the door from outside. It was the lady's cousin who was trying to open it to help her. The killer then plunged onto the poor woman to rip her apart. He tore out many chunks of her skin and threw them around the room. He started laughing louder and louder while his victim perished under him. Soon enough, the young woman couldn't struggle any longer. The killer then tore out her heart from her chest and ate it. When he finished, he started eating more of her flesh. He tore out her eyes and chewed on them as if they were gummies. And lastly, he tore out many of her fingers. During all that time, the cousin outside the room wouldn't stop hitting the door and yelling for help. When the shadowy killer finished eating, he then walked towards the camera. His face still couldn't be distinguished well due to the darkness. He spit what seemed to be blood and started cackling in pleasure. He blew the candle the lady had left there, removed whatever was blocking the door, and jumped out the window. Alfred was facing one of the most disturbing cases of his career. That criminal had managed to make him nervous. He decided to go to bed and try to get some rest, although it wasn't going to be easy to sleep without having nightmares about those images. The next day, he woke up with a bad headache and pressure in his chest. But despite the lack of sleep and discomfort, he got dressed and drove to the police station. He knew he had a long, hard day of work. When he arrived, Holly was waiting for him at her desk, with a worried expression that didn't go unnoticed by the man. "Good morning, Alfred. I see you with a bad face." He sighed and sat in his chair, placing the DVD cases he had brought home the day before. He told his partner that the images were much harsher than he had imagined. Seeing that criminal in full action, knowing that it was real, and that it wasn't a movie with actors and special effects, was heartbreaking. My legs were shaking as I watched him tear apart the pieces of that young woman's meat, as if it were a piece of beef on the plate. And from your face, I think you're not going to give me good news about this case. Holly shook her head and picked up a box of new clues in plastic bags from the floor. Then she gestured for her companion to take a look inside. As he did so, the man came across images and evidence that looked frighteningly familiar. It was a new crime by the same murderer. The photos of the remains of the deceased made his skin crawl. They had to find the person responsible as soon as possible. He spent the entire day looking for common links, reviewing the police list of criminals with criminal records with unknown whereabouts. He needed more data. When night came, he told his partner that he was taking the videos home again to review them. When he got home, he grabbed one of the DVDs and inserted it into the player with shaking hands. He carefully observed the first images that appeared on the screen again, writing down in a notebook all the elements that he found relevant. The half-open window, the shadow. When he reached the part where the murderer began his terrible act, tearing the body of the victim, he felt the impulse to stop the video, but he had to watch those images again. It was necessary to find that monster. He clenched his fists tightly, feeling anger and helplessness at the brutality of the crime. When the video came to an end, with the killer fleeing out the window after satisfying his hunger, Alfred stood frozen in front of the screen. He swallowed and realized he needed a moment to process all of this. He remained silent in horror, and suddenly he heard knocking in his house. Full of fear, he took his gun and walked slowly, looking for where the noise was coming from. He checked the kitchen, the bathroom, and finally, his bedroom. He gasped when he saw that the window was open. He perfectly remembered leaving it closed. He turned to grab his cell phone and call for backup. The murderer was waiting for him behind him. Alfred fired, but the creature seemed unfazed. That was not a human. The policeman began to scream desperately, but the murderer gagged him and threw him to the ground. Then he could hear him whisper,
"I want you to stay alive, conscious, and not pass out. I want you to be with me while I taste you."
Then he began to tear off the skin from his chest with his bare hands. Alfred screamed with all his might while he felt that his body had become a new menu for that beast. Then he licked his fingers and then tore them off with his teeth. While the police officer felt like he was going to faint from the pain, the killer licked his lips, chewing the flesh off the torn-off fingers, leaving only the bone. He seemed to be eating chicken wings, one after another, leaving his fingers clean while the victim bled to death. Then he put his hand into his abdomen, and when he reached his heart, Alfred had already died. The creature took the heart to the kitchen and placed it on a plate. He grabbed a bottle of wine and sat on the couch to eat dinner while watching television. In the background, he could see the pool of blood from Alfred's corpse. The murderer looked at him and wiped the blood running from his mouth with a napkin. He poured some wine into a glass and, savoring it, he imagined his next banquet. Many people know about the haunted doll Annabelle. However, some people who have visited the Warren Museum say that Lily is even more terrifying. It's as if she follows with her gaze everyone who visits that place, disturbing them during their visit. And hearing the story about her origin will turn your blood cold. Andrea had just turned 7 years old. However, she never learned to speak, and the only word she learned to say in her entire life was Lily. That was the name she gave to the doll her mother had gifted her. The doll was baby-shaped, and from the very first moment, Andrea felt a huge attachment to it. Lily became her best friend, and they became inseparable. Andrea found in that toy the friendship she never got with all the other girls since she couldn't speak. 2 years later, Andrea's relationship with her doll was the same. However, one fateful day, she climbed to the roof with her doll to show her the view from there. But the two ended up falling into the backyard instead. Little Andrea perished immediately. This caused a huge commotion through the entire neighborhood, and all the neighbors attended her funeral. The girl was buried with her doll, the only friend she ever found. However, for some bizarre reason, 7 days later, the parents found Andrea's doll sitting in the house backyard. At first, they thought that someone was playing a sick prank on them by placing a similar doll there, although they also believed that maybe their daughter was trying to manifest herself through the doll. And so the family finally decided to keep the doll and stored it as a memento. Then 1 week later, Andrea's mother saw the doll move its lips, just like her daughter would do when trying to speak. She thought she was going insane. Then one night, Andrea's mother was jolted awake after hearing her daughter scream. And once she found the source of the scream, she saw Lily the doll, crying. Horrified, she called her husband, hoping he wouldn't see what she was saying. But unfortunately, he confirmed it wasn't an illusion. As time went by, they noticed how that toy was appropriating the features of their dead daughter, looking more and more like Andrea every day. It started with the eyes, then the hair, and so on, until becoming almost identical. Every night became a nightmare for them, since they would hear steps and constant laughter all around the house. And the tipping point was when the doll attacked one of the kids in the neighborhood. Adopting the appearance of Andrea, Lily took the kid to the house's backyard. And then, in front of his eyes, Lily transformed back into a doll. The kid ran out of there while she mocked him and made him trip. The family was terrified and decided to donate the doll to the Warren Museum. However, the very morning the people from the museum would pick up the doll, the husband had been stabbed. And by his side was Lily, covered in blood and crying. After that, Lily was placed in a wooden booth with the help of a priest, who concluded that the doll had not been possessed by the spirit of Andrea, but instead had been possessed by a demon who wanted to take the souls of children. It had been 10 years since the horrible incident between Emily, Mark, Holly, and Grandma. Holly was already a teenager. Thanks to therapy, she had overcome her fears and anxiety caused by the last day held by her grandmother. Emily and Mark also progressed in their fears as the months passed and their lives returned to what they always had. But the family's peace of mind began to be clouded the day they received a letter from the psychiatric center. It was from Lisa. She explained to them that she was very sorry for the mistakes she had made in the past. Everything had been caused by trauma after the loss of her 7-year-old daughter in the pool. At that time, she hadn't been able to accept it and live in a world where her little girl was no longer there. And she was trying to find a culprit and a replacement for the void that had been left. For this reason, she blamed her son, when he was only 5 years old, for letting her sister die and not saving her. And she wanted to get her back by trying to turn her granddaughter into a copy of her deceased daughter. Mark began to get nervous as Emily read the first words of the letter aloud. He didn't want to hear excuses that would bring back the pain of the past. But his wife continued reading until the end. Before saying goodbye, Lisa told them that the doctors considered that with the medication and therapy she was once again fit to visit and leave the center. She had learned very well from her mistakes and had worked to change her behavior. She asked them not to forget her and to let her show them all her repentance because she didn't have much time left. When Emily read the last sentence, she was thoughtful. What do you think she meant by saying she doesn't have much time left? Is she sick? Mark took the letter from her hands and looked into her eyes. Emily, don't start. My mother is a textbook manipulator. I don't know if she's sick or not, but what I know is that no matter how much therapy she does, she will continue to be the woman who almost ended my family. Promise me you will not do anything crazy. She nodded and gave her husband a hug. Once again, she felt that terrible feeling of suffocation in her chest, which had taken her so long to diminish. Neither parent wanted to tell Holly the news about her grandmother, although little by little the kitchen drawer began to fill with several letters from the woman imploring their forgiveness. And the young woman ended up finding out. She, who had a personality very similar to her mother, felt sorry for the old woman. Her memories may have been more clouded by having lived them as a child, but when she read her grandmother's letters, she couldn't contain her tears and compassion for her. I know she has hurt us a lot, but what if she's dying? We must give her the opportunity to apologize. She's alone, and she will die alone in that center if we don't go see her. As she spoke, a tear slid down the young woman's cheek, and upon seeing her, also her mother. However, her father remained serious. He was disappointed, and he felt misunderstood to see that the two could forgive something so serious for him. I am not going to prevent you from anything, but please just promise me that you will be careful. Emily and Holly, after a long discussion, finally decided to give Lisa a chance to visit and apologize. They called a psychiatric center and coordinated the details to meet the grandmother one afternoon in one of its wards. However, the next day, just as mother and daughter were about to leave the house, the doorbell surprised them. Emily went straight to the door and came face to face with Lisa's fragile figure. Although she now seemed serene and different from the person who had caused them so much suffering, she couldn't help but feel a tremor in her voice and in her hands. Lisa smiled kindly and asked permission to enter. Holly walked over and helped her mother out of that tense moment by inviting her grandmother inside. The first few seconds, the tension in the air was palpable, but the grandmother took the initiative and with a smile began to tell them what her life had been like in the last few years in the psychiatric center. Sharing stories about the new friends she had made and the therapeutic activities she did, she was trying to convince Emily and Holly that she had changed, that she was now seeking peace and forgiveness. Although her speech seemed sincere, Emily couldn't help but squeeze her daughter's hand tightly every time Lisa got too close. The conversation seemed to relax until Mark returned home. When he entered and saw the three women laughing in the living room, his face tightened. Nervous and barely able to speak, Mark stared at Lisa and in a firm voice asked her to leave. His mother tried to explain that she just wanted to rebuild her relationship with her family. However, Mark was not willing to give in. His memories of the past were still too fresh in his mind. Holly was disappointed in her father, and Emily tried to mediate and smooth the situation, but Mark insisted that he didn't want his mother around. Finally, Lisa, with an expression of sadness and resignation, got up and left the house. The granddaughter got up and offered to accompany her to the door, but her grandmother told her that it was not necessary, that she knew the way out. Emily, Mark, and Holly, meanwhile, remained silent in the living room, feeling uncomfortable. What they didn't know was that before leaving, the grandmother had grabbed a set of keys from the little box they had at the entrance, where they always left their keys when they arrived. The family slept that night thinking about the situation. The next day, everyone left the house. Holly went to school and Mark and Emily went to their respective jobs. When the house was empty, the grandmother entered, using the keys with several shopping bags. In the room where Holly slept, there was a part of the ceiling that slid down and from which a ladder fell to go up to the attic. The grandmother carefully entered the attic through the stairs and brought up everything she had in her bags. There, she carried several cans of food, drinks, and blankets. She prepared a kind of dwelling with everything she had there. She used an old mattress, several cushions, and made a bed. And from another bag, she took out the photo of her deceased daughter and placed it on a small table. "We will be together again, Lena. No matter how grown up you are, you will always be my little girl," the lady said while kissing the photo of her daughter, who had a great resemblance to Holly. Suddenly, she heard noises, so she closed the access to the attic tightly and remained silent. Putting her ear to the floor, she could hear Holly come into her room. It seemed to her that she was talking to herself until she realized that she was talking to someone on the phone. And from the tone of the conversation, something told her that it was with the boy. Lisa became tense. She thought that her daughter was still too young to have a boyfriend. She didn't like that. Hours later, everyone left the house again, and then Lisa took the opportunity to go back down to the house. There, she took a shower and was browsing through Holly's personal belongings. For the next few days, Lisa continued her strange routine. She waited patiently for the house to be empty before descending from her makeshift shelter in the attic and exploring her granddaughter's life. She immersed herself in her belongings and read her diary, although she tried hard not to leave a trace of her presence. Her obsession intensified when she discovered that Holly was in a relationship with a boy named Alex. The grandmother spied on every message and every interaction, fearing that this boy could influence the young woman's life in some negative way. One of those days, Lisa put her ear to the ground to try to hear as much as she could of a conversation between Holly and Emily. Her mother told her that she had to accompany her father to a doctor's appointment and then they would do some shopping at the mall. She asked the young woman if she wanted to go with them and she answered no, she would stay at home watching a movie. After a short time, Lisa could no longer hear the young woman in her room. So she went down through the trapdoor and looked for her granddaughter around the house, being very careful not to make noise. When she reached the door to the living room, she was surprised to hear Holly talking to someone. She thought she was alone. She looked through one of the glass windows in the door and saw that her granddaughter was hugging a boy and they were exchanging affectionate words. Holly had taken advantage of the moment when her parents weren't at home to call her boyfriend and secretly stay alone. Lisa couldn't stand that image. She had to do something. Suddenly, she saw how the boy got up and told her granddaughter that he was going to the bathroom. Lisa ran to crouch behind one of the bedroom doors. While the young man was in the bathroom, the grandmother quietly went to the kitchen and grabbed one of the knives. As soon as the boy grabbed the door handle and left the bathroom, she surprised him on the other side by covering his mouth and stabbing him several times in the stomach. "You will never touch my sweet girl again." Meanwhile, Holly remained in the living room, ignoring the noise of the television. The grandmother left the boy lying in the bathroom and ran back to her hiding place. It wouldn't take long for Holly to find her boyfriend's lifeless body. Just as she closed the access to the stairs, she could hear a scream that made the walls shake. The grandmother remained hidden. In the attic, no one would look for her. Everyone would assume that the murderer had escaped. The next day, the grandmother took advantage of one of the moments in which everyone had left the house to shower and go outside. As she crossed the front yard, a neighbor greeted her and asked if Emily was home. "Oh, well, no. I just came to visit them, but no one has opened the door," the grandmother replied, uncomfortable at having been discovered around the house. When the family returned home, the same neighbor approached them. He wanted to give them a package that a delivery man had left for them. Mark thanked him for the gesture, and when they were about to say goodbye, something stopped him. "This morning, another lady also came to visit you. I thought you were at home, but she told me no. That's why I waited until the afternoon to bring it to you." Mark turned pale and asked for a physical description of the lady he had seen. And of course, it was Lisa. Emily grabbed her husband's arm and asked him what was happening. Mark swallowed and asked Holly to come into the house, and once he was alone with his wife, he asked her if she thought Grandma could be behind the death of Holly's boyfriend. Emily put her hand on her chest and, startled, told him that it couldn't be, but a terrible doubt had already taken hold of her too. They entered the house and the woman began to prepare dinner. When she opened the cutlery drawer, something didn't feel right. They were all carefully placed, straight and aligned. Something that wasn't usual in their family. She only knew one person with that level of obsession. She started to sweat. She took off her apron, put on her shoes, and said goodbye to her husband and daughter. She had to do something to find out if the nightmare was repeating itself. When she wanted to grab her house keys, she saw that they were gone. She asked her husband and daughter if anyone had kept them out of confusion, but they both replied that they only had their own. The fact that the house keys had disappeared could explain why someone entered the home to murder her daughter's boyfriend without forcing the door. But who had access there? She got in the car and headed to the psychiatric center. When she arrived, she asked the receptionist if she could see Lisa. Her hands began to shake when she told her that Lisa had been gone for several days. She had told him that she had a place to stay and that she would spend a few days disconnecting. Emily did not like that at all. More and more things made her think that her grandmother was still the maniacal murderer they knew. When she was driving home, something made her hit the brakes. It was the grandmother who was walking near her house. Nervously, Emily asked her what she was doing there, and the grandmother told her that she was going to pay them a visit. "Lisa, where have you been these last 2 days? I have gone to the center and they have told me that you have not slept there," she told her threateningly. The grandmother already had an alibi prepared. "Oh, I'm spending a few days at a friend's house. She's away on vacation and she asked me to stay there taking care of her plants." Emily did not believe her. "So you won't have a problem inviting me for coffee and a chat at the house you're staying at, right?" Lisa smiled. She knew Emily was suspicious, but she would manage to continue deceiving her. She told her that she would call her tomorrow and send her the address. That afternoon, Mark and Holly didn't leave the house at any time, so Grandma had nowhere to spend the night. Trying to have a place to stay, she looked for easy prey. Walking down the street, she saw how a little old woman walked slowly with bags in her hand to enter her home. Lisa offered to help her, and the lady smiled at her. When they were inside, the grandmother hit her on the head with a vase and left her unconscious on the floor. The next morning, Lisa sent the location of the house to Emily. Shortly after, the woman showed up at the door. Emily had to know if Lisa had an alibi to make sure she wasn't the one who had entered her house to kill. So she began to ask her questions, but the grandmother had a very well-prepared speech. For every question, she had a perfect excuse that exonerated her. At one point, Emily asked her why it smelled so unpleasant there. Lisa apologized, justifying that it was because of the cats. They had defecated all over the room where they slept, but she had been unable to clean it because she was afraid of them. Emily offered to clean it up and got up walking in the direction of where the smell was coming from. But Lisa quickly cut her off and told her that she wanted to meet her and Holly another time because she had been sad that their last conversation had ended so abruptly. Just as she was saying those words, Lisa looked at the floor and saw how blood was beginning to come out from under the door where she had locked the old woman's body. To prevent her daughter-in-law from looking there and not raising suspicions, she asked her to excuse her, since she had to go to the psychiatric center to get her medication, and with that excuse, she accompanied her to the exit. Lisa had to get out of that house before someone missed the old woman. So she waited just enough time for Emily to get to work, and she went to her son and daughter-in-law's house to hide in the attic again. When Emily finished at work, she decided to return home to where Lisa was living to apologize. That lady had changed, and she hadn't been fair. But when she passed by, she saw a police car stopped in front of the house. She approached them and asked one of the officers what had happened, since her mother-in-law was there. Then the police officer asked her if she was a direct relative of the deceased. Deceased? Oh God, I saw her a few hours ago. The agents told her that she had to present a statement to reconstruct the events and ask her to accompany them to the ambulance to identify the body. Emily, with tears in her eyes, agreed. But her face was tinged with terror when they opened the zipper of the cloth that covered the corpse, and she saw that the woman didn't know her. Grandma had tricked her again. She told everything that happened to the police and told them that their family was in danger. Lisa had been the murderer of her daughter's boyfriend. She was sure. The police accompanied her home to check if the family was okay. Seeing that his wife came in with agents, Mark nervously asked them what had happened to her. Emily told him everything she had discovered and asked her husband where their daughter was. He replied that she was studying in a room. The mother went there to hug her and discovered that the room was completely disordered, as if someone had hid everything. And the worst thing, her daughter was not there. Emily began to scream and cry desperately, when suddenly Mark put a finger to her lips and asked his wife to listen. Immediately, everyone looked at the ceiling, and without wasting time, they opened the access to go up to the attic. There was the grandmother who was holding her granddaughter by the hair and holding a knife to her neck. "Don't do it, Lisa. If you love Holly, do not do it." Emily cried and pleaded. The grandmother asked everyone to leave there if they didn't want something bad to happen. Mark, determined and confident that his mother would never hurt Holly because she was the only person she loved, lay on top of his mother and took the knife from her. In this struggle, the man ended up wounded in the abdomen and his daughter ran into her mother's arms. The grandmother, out of her mind, threatened the police officers with stabbing Mark with the knife more times if they didn't let her go. And everyone knew that she would have no mercy with her son and would keep her word. Emily yelled at the officers to let her go. She couldn't allow her mother-in-law to end her husband's life, and they did it like that. Once again, the murderous grandmother had escaped without being convicted of her crimes. But could it have been the last? "Mama, can Karim stay home alone?" I pleaded. My mother looked at me with a serious face, wondering if I had lost my mind. She was not going to change her mind. "Your brother is too small. You know very well that it can't be. If you want to go with your friends, you will have to take him with you. I'll make it up to you another day, Zayda. Now I have to go to work." I sighed as loudly as I could to show my mother how much she had ruined my plans. "Okay, I'll take him with me," I grumbled. My challenge was to keep her from finding out about the plan I had. I was not going to let my date be ruined just because her work shift had been changed at the last minute. My mother came over to hug me and Karim. She whispered a thank you in my ear and walked out the door. Shortly after, I heard the car engine driving away. Then I sighed deeply again before calling my brother. "Come on, Karim, put on your shoes, we're leaving." His answer? "Of course. Let him play with the console for a little while longer." I rolled my eyes. When mom and dad are not around, I'm the one in charge, and I say we're leaving now. While we were sitting in my car, Karim looked out the window and acted like he was offended. He didn't like me giving him orders. However, his stubbornness wasn't very convincing, as I could see him bobbing his head to the music playing on the radio. When we passed in front of Mayra's house, he couldn't remain silent. "Zayda, shouldn't we have turned right to see your friend?" I smiled, and I told him there was a slight change of plans. We would meet Mayra and the rest of the group somewhere else. He continued to ask questions for the rest of the trip, but I resisted. When we arrived, I saw my brother staring outside, probably trying to guess where we were. Luckily, the sun had already set, so he couldn't see much of what was there. I parked right behind my friend's car and turned to my brother, explaining where we had gone in the most dramatic tone possible. "We have arrived. We are going to a bonfire with my friends next to the abandoned castle. We're going to tell scary stories." He looked at me with wide eyes. "Mom and Dad won't let us come here alone," he protested. I stayed calm, told him not to act like a baby, and assured him that we weren't alone. I pointed to the car in front of us and told him that my friends were already there. Without waiting for a response, I turned off the lights, unbuckled my seatbelt, and got out of the vehicle. My brother did the same and followed me. We walked along a dark path full of vegetation with the only light from my flashlight. Mayra, Omar, and Adam were already waiting for us with a lit bonfire. When they saw me, they raised their beer cans in greetings. "Whoa, Zayda, in the end, you managed to come," Omar said, expressing what the others were probably thinking too. My three friends greeted me with a little applause as a joke. But when Karim stumbled behind me and they saw him, they suddenly fell silent. Mayra lowered the beer behind her. My friend was still a minor. Of course, they weren't amused that I had brought my brother with me. "Sorry guys, I had no choice. My father is traveling and my mother's shift has been changed for tonight, so it was either bring him or stay home with him." The only one who didn't seem to care was Omar. He immediately put his beer can on the ground and stood up to greet my brother. He asked him how old he was and what his favorite video game was. Karim changed his face and began to talk to him about his games. My friend invited him to sit next to him and he seemed delighted. Omar winked at me, after which I mouthed a silent "thank you." A few seconds later, the five of us were sitting around the fire. Mayra grabbed another can of beer and handed it to me. Then he looked at Karim, hesitant. She cleared her throat. "Sorry, we only have beer, but if you want, we can go to the gas station to buy you a soda." Karim just shook his head. When he saw that I was drinking from the can that my friend had given me, my brother opened his mouth exaggerately. Afterwards, he approached me and quietly asked me if Mom and Dad knew that I drank alcohol. He whispered, but spoke so loudly that the others could easily hear him. If her parents found out, they would punish her for sure. Then she gave me an insistent look. I had to keep my brother bribed so he wouldn't spill the beans. I thought about various pranks he had done at home and that I had kept secret to avoid punishment. Blackmail. Quid pro quo. You shut up, me too, you betray me, we will both be punished. Fortunately, my idea worked, and a few minutes later, we were sitting relaxed around the campfire, talking about high school and our lives. Omar was very attentive to my brother, keeping him entertained. It was what I liked most about him, the big heart he had and how much he cared about me. I have to admit that I increasingly doubted whether ours was a relationship that went beyond friendship. Every day, I liked his way of being more. Karim was pretty calm, but we all know what little kids are like. If they don't receive constant attention or without games, TV or consoles nearby, they get bored. And then the whining began. "I'm hungry," was one of his first comments. Then, "I'm cold," followed by, "When is mom coming? Can we go now?" My friends didn't say anything, but I knew I had ruined their night. So I decided to entertain him a little. "Do you want us to do something fun?" "Okay, we'll have fun. How about a little horror story?" "Do you know that one from the program years ago, where the bad kids went from?" That caught the attention of Adam and Mara. Omar, on the other hand, seemed confused. He asked me if it was a good idea to tell my brother a horror story, warning me that he would have nightmares all night afterwards. I assured him that my brother was no coward, and I looked at him with a mischievous face. Karim shook his head, as I expected, although he knew that brave wasn't the adjective that best defined him. To be honest, I had no idea how he would react to the story, but it was too late to feel guilty. So I started. My father told me that years ago, when the country was in post-war times, it was very common for parents to leave their children watching a show on television. The program lasted about 30 minutes and contained strange and sinister images. Knowing what I know today, I believe it was an attempt by the government, aided by the media, to use scare tactics to keep children in their place. Because the moral of each episode revolved around things like bad children go to bed late, bad children steal food from the refrigerator at night, bad children don't obey their parents and teachers. He told me that he saw it, although he no longer remembers many details. However, what he didn't forget was what the closing of each program was like. It was the same in all the episodes. The camera zoomed in on an old, rusty, closed door. As he got closer and closer to the door, he began to hear some agonizing and terrible screams, which made him very afraid. As for children's programming, I found it somewhat terrifying. While the screams continued to be heard, a text appeared on the screen that said, "That's where the bad kids go." And then, little by little, it faded to black. But the story doesn't end there. It turns out that years later, one of his friends studied journalism, and he always had that show in mind. He had to write an article for a magazine, and he couldn't think of anything other than to start researching the program. He collected data and managed to find out the location of the studio where it was recorded. The site was very remote. No one would imagine that it was broadcast from there. Well, friend entered the old building. It isn't known what he saw there, but since then, he has been admitted to a mental health facility. He only managed to send a text message to my father with the address. The moment my father got there, he was lying on the floor, staring into space. And he stopped talking since then. When I finished this story, everyone was silent. Only the crackling of the flames could be heard. Then I realized that Karim was shaking next to me. I had gone too far. I just wanted to entertain them, but not to scare my brother so much. "Is that true?" he asked me. "Yes," Mara responded. "And at night, sometimes they come here to look for new kids." Omar interrupted her and asked her to stop. He had remained serious. Mara accused me of being a liar. She said I had made it up. But it wasn't like that. My father hadn't lied to me. In fact, he even knew the address because he had told me. Adam and Mayra started laughing when I told them I could take them there. They thought I was kidding them. And I won't be anything else, but no one beats me to being proud. Well, maybe you laughed to hide the fear that has entered you, because I'm sure that none of you would dare to go if I told you where it is. Mayra looked at me defiantly. She always loved to be on top, the prettiest, the smartest. Of course, she also had to be the bravest. Karim remained unusually quiet the entire time. And although I should have been glad that he was no longer complaining, I felt a lot of remorse. I definitely didn't want to use fear to silence him. Adam started to propose that the 5 of them go to that place. It didn't seem like a good idea to me. At another time, maybe I wouldn't care, but with my brother there that day, I had begun to feel sorry for him, and I thought it was best to take him home. But Myra began with her typical provocations. It was the only thing I hated about my friend. Couldn't it be that you're the one who's pooping with fear? What a coincidence. Right now you're worried about bringing Karim home. 10 minutes ago, you didn't think the same. With anger, I got up and told them that I would show them where that place was. Afterwards, I would leave and each person would decide if they wanted to enter or not. I got in the car and my brother did the same. He was serious and scared. There was no doubt. He would tell my mother everything that happened as soon as she arrived. I would end this nonsense by taking them to the place my father had told me about and return home. I started and my friends drove behind us, following us. When we arrived, we had to go with several flashlights. We had to cross a fairly long road and there were no streetlights or anything. It was a completely abandoned place. When I had gone years ago with my father, we had gone during the day and we didn't get too close. He didn't like being so close since it brought back bad memories of when he found his friend on the ground and had to help him. At what moment had this stupid idea of telling him that story occurred to me? With the 4 flashlights, we pointed at the building. It was black. It looked like it had been set on fire. I told him that I would stay outside. I wouldn't go in with my brother, nor would I leave him alone. Omar had offered to stay with the 2 of us, so only Adam and Myra would enter. My 2 friends came in laughing. When they went inside, we stopped seeing them, but we could still hear them joking, faking the sound of ghosts and monsters. I stroked my brother's hair and told him that my friends were like clowns making jokes all day. He smiled, although it was obvious that he was still uneasy. Omar and I started talking about other things, about serious, funny viral videos and any nonsense we could think of to keep my brother distracted. The minutes passed and Adam and Myra didn't come out. It was starting to get pretty cold and I was tired of waiting, so we called out their names to get them to come out, although no one answered. The little joke was starting to bother us and I told Omar that if they took any longer, I would go home. He thought the same as me, so he asked me to take him home in my car. Suddenly, I saw Karim looking around with wide eyes. "Did you hear that?" He asked me quietly, interrupting Omar. I sighed and put an arm around his shoulder. "Karim, there is nothing. The story that Dad told me is a lie." Suddenly, Omar waved his hand at me. "No, Zahida, shh. I heard something too." The 3 of us stayed silent and listened attentively. In the background, we could hear something similar to crying. Karim squeezed my hand tightly. I told him that it was probably the noise of some animal trying to calm him down. But both he and Omar noticed that there was doubt in my voice. Even my friend, who was normally very calm, seemed tense. "I have enough. I'm leaving," I told Omar. He warned me that we couldn't leave and leave our friends inside. Damn, I didn't have to be there. But I knew I couldn't leave. We approached the door and called out their names. Together, we took a few steps through the rubble. There was a terrible smell. In the background, we could see a door. It was the rusty, old door to the program, just as my father had described to me. He approached slowly and stuck his head inside the door for a few seconds. Suddenly, he turned around and yelled at me. "Get out, get out, get out!" I didn't even pay attention to whether he was following me at that moment. I only cared about getting my brother out of there. I got in the car, and when I looked in the rearview mirror, I saw that Adam was sitting in the back seat. My brother screamed. For a split second, I thought his pale face was that of a ghost. After recovering from the shock, I asked him where Mara and Omar were, but he didn't say a single word to me. He had a lost look. He seemed gone. I drove as fast as I could until I reached a busy road. What had I done? But all I could think was that my little Karim was safe. To this day, I have no idea who or what we heard in that building. Myra disappeared and Adam stopped talking from that day on. Like my father's friend, he was admitted to a center where he still looks lost to this day. Omar, I don't know how, but he was able to get out. He barely told me anything about what he saw there. He didn't want to do it for my safety. Those screams at the end of the program my father watched, there were no special effects. In the room at the back of that building, there was a large microphone in the center which collected all the cries and screams of those who were there. Karim, aside from the initial shock, he handled it surprisingly well. Of course, he told mom and dad everything as soon as they got home, and they gave me a big punishment. I can't tell you more. That would make more people start investigating and get there. But it is true that there is a place where bad children go. We know you love horror stories, so today we bring you one that will definitely make you jump out of your seat. Antonio was a wax sculptor who would frequently spend long periods of time away from home. The previous year, his house was robbed many times, and since he had to leave again, Antonio asked his good friend Martin to spend a few days in his house. The first thing that caught Martin's attention was the size of the house and how cold it was. It was far away from the city's downtown, so that Antonio could have enough peace and quiet to do his work. Martin was impressed when he saw the big rooms where Antonio kept his finished pieces. But without a doubt, what impressed Martin the most was Antonio's workshop. Specifically, he noticed a figure covered with a white blanket, which seemed to be the sculpture of a man. All the other sculptures were exposed, so the covered one sparked his curiosity. However, since he didn't want to risk ruining his friend's work, he just left the covered sculpture alone. After walking around and familiarizing himself with what was going to be his house for a few days, Martin sat down to watch some TV. Tired, he went to bed shortly after. He fell asleep pretty quickly, but a noise at about 3 in the morning made him wake up abruptly. Still half asleep, he got up to see what was going on. And knowing about the house robberies his friend had suffered in the past, he thought that maybe burglars had gotten into the house again. The noises were coming from the workshop, so he quickly went to check it out. When he opened the door, he didn't see anybody, but he noticed something was different. The covered sculpture that had caught his attention was no longer there. He stopped to analyze for a moment if he actually saw it there or in a different place, and started to doubt. Scared, he went back to his room, trying to convince himself that the noise he heard came from the street or a neighbor. He didn't know the house perfectly well, so maybe he was missing some small detail. However, when he went back to the hallway, he found something completely unexpected. There it was, right in front of him, the sculpture covered in a blanket. How could it be? Who the heck put it there? He didn't remember seeing it when he went out of his room. Very scared, he grabbed the sculpture and took it back to the workshop. He locked the workshop door and scoured the entire house looking for anything strange. But everything was in its place and nothing seemed to be missing. He went back to bed feeling scared and perplexed. And after a while of thinking about what happened, he fell asleep. When he woke up, it was already morning. He headed to the workshop, and when he got to the door, he was petrified in shock. The door was open. Somebody had definitely been there. He slammed the door shut and headed to the kitchen where he had left his laptop. He wanted to contact Antonio and tell him about what was happening. However, something stopped him in the hallway. There it was, once again, the covered sculpture. Martin felt true horror after seeing that, and with whatever he was wearing, rushed out of the house. However, after being outside of the house for the entire day, he decided he had to go back to verify that everything was in order and let his friend Antonio know about what was happening. When he came back, he didn't find the covered sculpture anywhere. It was gone. Not sure if it was burglars or something more strange, Martin grabbed his computer and called Antonio. Through a video call, Martin told him all about what happened and also told him he was very scared. Antonio asked Martin to calm down, but also told him that he never covered his sculptures with blankets, that he always left them uncovered. And suddenly, Antonio stopped speaking. Martin saw in Antonio's panicked expression that something bad was going on. And suddenly, Antonio asked, "What's that behind you? There's a blanket." Martin turned around and there it was again, the covered sculpture just a few meters from him. While Antonio kept calling and calling his friend, Martin armed himself with courage and uncovered the sculpture. In that instant, Antonio heard a deafening screech from the other side of his computer and the call was disconnected. Very scared, the artist returned to his house as fast as he could. When he arrived, he didn't find Martin anywhere. But the workshop still had the same sculpture covered with a white blanket. He uncovered the sculpture and was never able to forget what he saw. It was a wax sculpture of his friend with an expression of true horror, with its eyes widened out, and there were blood stains everywhere. It was a quiet night. Ben and Rachel were preparing dinner together. He cut the broccoli while she worked on the sauce. The couple joked while she had to supervise her boyfriend's every step. Cooking was not Ben's strong point, and on several occasions they had ended up calling a pizza place with home delivery for having scorched the food. That day, she had chosen to give him simple tasks, while she joked with him about his lack of aptitude to become a chef. "You already know that I'm very good at cleaning, ironing, fixing washing machines and computers. I can't be perfect at everything," he replied while winking at her. Suddenly, the doorbell startled them. They looked at each other surprised. It was quite late and neither of them expected visitors that night. Ben walked over to one of the windows to see who it was. It was his friend Sean. Well, more than friend, you could say ex-friend. They had had a great friendship since childhood, until the love between him and Rachel broke the relationship. Sean had met Rachel and they dated for a few months. During that time, she accompanied him to hang out with his friends. And that's where the crush between her and Ben arose. When he realized that he was beginning to fall in love with the young woman, he tried to avoid her. He didn't want to spoil his friendship with his friend. She did the same with Sean, decided to break up with him, justifying the breakup with the fact that her feelings had changed, and she no longer felt in love. Sean had a very bad time. Rachel had been his first great love, and he hadn't been able to get over it. For their part, although Ben and Rachel had tried to hide their feelings, finally, sometime later, they began a relationship. Sean hadn't liked that at all, and from that day on, he stopped talking to both his best friend and his ex-partner. For this reason, it was so strange that Sean was waiting outside at that time of night and without calling. She asked what her ex-boyfriend was doing there, and Ben confirmed that he had no idea. But if he was at the door after so long without speaking, it must be important. His girlfriend told him that she didn't want to see him. She didn't want to start an argument with him. So he assured her that he would tell her that he was alone at home. Meanwhile, she would wait in the kitchen. Ben opened the door with a forced smile. "Oh, Sean, what a long time. I'm glad to see ya." The young man, with a nervous and worried expression, asked him if he could come in, or if he was accompanied and it was a bad time. Ben tried to hide how uncomfortable that situation was for him by telling him that he was alone and that he could enter without any problem. He made sure to say it loudly so that Rachel could hear him and stay in the kitchen without leaving. Then Sean entered the house with a gift box in his hand. They entered the room and began to exchange a couple of nervous phrases. "How is everything? Where do you work now?" Sean stared at one of the photo frames on the living room table, where the couple was hugging in the picture. As he looked at it, he told Ben that he was sorry for everything that had happened and how things had ended. Then he asked if Rachel was there. No, Sean, I already told you I'm home alone. She's at her parents' house." Then the young man told him that he had only gone there to say hello and give him that box. It was wrapped in pretty wrapping paper and had an envelope on top. Confused, Ben grabbed the gift. His ex-friend was increasingly nervous, something that did not go unnoticed. He asked him if he wanted something to drink, and he insisted that he open his gift as soon as possible. He wanted to see his reaction. Ben smiled at him and grabbed the envelope to read the card first, but Sean asked him to start with the box, so as not to reveal the contents of the gift before opening it. Ben obeyed, lifting the paper and revealing a cardboard box. When he opened it, he was surprised to see nothing. The bottom was so dark, it seemed to have no end. "What is this?" he asked. But when he looked up, Sean was already gone. He approached the door and saw how he got into his car running while shouting, "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry, man." Ben was glad that his friend had finally taken the step of mending their relationship, although that box had left him uneasy. Rachel came out of hiding and asked him what happened. He couldn't answer and quickly went to the kitchen to grab a flashlight. He shined the light on the bottom of the box and was surprised when he still couldn't see anything. Then he grabbed a pencil that was on the table and put it inside the cardboard box. The two jumped back when they saw that the pencil had disappeared without making a sound, as if it had been thrown into a deep, bottomless well. They looked at each other. This had to be a joke, but they didn't understand the trick. Then he remembered the letter that accompanied the gift. It was on top of one of the pieces of furniture in the living room. He grabbed it and handed it to Rachel, who began reading it out loud. "Dear Ben, I'm sorry for everything that happened to us and what's happening to you now, but I had to give it to someone. I'm not sure, but I know he can't move while you're looking at him. Whatever you do, don't take your eyes off him. He wants you to look the other way." Suddenly, the sound of a pencil falling to the ground made them turn their gaze. It was the pencil that Ben had thrown into the cardboard. But the worst wasn't that. From inside the box, the head of what appeared to be a man picked out. They both screamed in fear. What was that? The box was on a table. It was impossible for a man to fit inside. But he didn't look like a doll or something inert. That head was alive, and he looked straight into their eyes with a penetrating look. His hair was wet, like sweat, dripping all over his face. Scared, Ben decided to call Sean. As he walked to the side, he could see the head turn his eyes, following him with his gaze. He made several calls, but Sean didn't answer. He had turned off his cell phone. His girlfriend asked him what was happening, but he didn't know what to answer. He didn't understand anything. He decided to make more attempts and leave a message on Sean's answering machine. While he walked around the room looking at that sinister head, Rachel's voice asked again, "What's going on, Ben?" And he nervously told her that he had already answered her, that he had no idea what was happening. What Ben didn't know was that on this occasion, it wasn't his girlfriend who had spoken, but rather the head had perfectly imitated her voice. Seconds later, a voice identical to his could be heard repeating the same message he had left on Sean's answering machine. That thing could copy their voices perfectly. Nervous and scared, he grabbed the car keys and told Rachel they had to get out of there. They didn't know what that was, but his girlfriend remained motionless, staring at his head. She told him that they couldn't leave. The letter said that they couldn't look away from him. Maybe if they did, they would be in danger. They had to know what happened if neither of them looked at him. It was necessary to know what they were facing. They gathered their courage, counted to 3, and both looked away from that creature and looked at each other. After a few seconds, they looked back at the cardboard. The man had placed his fingers on the top of the box. Terrified and trembling, the young man began to shout at him. "What are you? What do you want from us?" The sinister creature inside began to emit voices again. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, man," Ben thought. That phrase, that voice, it was the phrase that Sean said to him when he said goodbye. Then the thing continued playing Sean's voice, saying, "Just Ben, don't let him leave the house." He didn't understand anything. But if those words were a copy of his friend's voice, he owed him a lot of explanations. He had to find him and know what that was. Then Ben said to his girlfriend, "It's supposed to. If you look at it, it doesn't move. We must separate." Rachel opened her eyes in horror. She wouldn't allow herself to be separated from him. "I have to find Sean. I don't know why he gave us this, but I'll find out. We don't know what this is. It may be harmless. You don't drive, which is why I need you to stay here staring at it non-stop while I get help and find that damn Sean. I will break down his door if necessary." The young man grabbed a chair and placed it in front of the cardboard box, accompanying his girlfriend to sit down. Then he grabbed a knife from the kitchen and placed it in his hand to defend herself if she needed it. He would return as soon as possible. He kissed his partner on the forehead and nervously ran out of the house and started his car. Ben continued to frantically call Sean with his vehicle's hands-free phone. As he still didn't get a response, he left one more message on the answering machine. In this case, he asked him about the message that the creature in the box had issued with his same voice. What had he said to that head? Suddenly, Sean answered on the other end of the line. Ben's voice shook, asking him why he hadn't answered him. But Sean, bewildered, just asked Ben to repeat what he had said earlier in his answering machine message. Ben ignored his question and continued insisting. He needed to know what that thing was, and the reason for that threatening message from his head. Sean couldn't believe it. He assured him that he didn't even know that head could speak or make sounds. Don't lie to me. It was your voice, Sean. He repeated what you said. Why did you want me not to leave the house? Ben continued to insist and ask. He needed to know if Rachel was in danger. When he mentioned Rachel and confirmed that she was also in the house, Sean began to shake and scream at him, feeling panic take over. No, you have to stay looking at him. Where are you? Don't tell me you're gone. Ben tried to calm the situation by assuring him that they had everything under control. Rachel had stayed home in order to keep the thing quiet. But his friend shocked him with his response. No, Ben, you, damn, I gave it to you. You were the one who had to keep your eyes on that thing. Sean started crying, and that alarmed Ben. It could not be. He had endangered his girlfriend by leaving her there alone. He swerved the car and changed course, returning to his house. On the other end of the phone, Sean was asking him where he was going, guessing what his friend's decision was going to be. Ben, now don't come back. You can't go back, do you hear me? Listen to me, do not come back. But Ben hung up the call and ignored his warning. Upon arrival, the lights were off, plunging the house into darkness. Even the switch seemed to have been forced, as if someone had tampered with it. Trembling and with his heart pounding, he groped for the lantern. When he finally found it and turned it on, he could see that the cardboard box was no longer resting on the table where he had left it, nor was Rachel. In its place, there was a large paddle of water on the floor, and also the knife he had given her for protection, intact and without any blood stains. He felt all the pores of his skin stand on end. He heard a noise in the background in the kitchen, carefully shining the flashlight as he passed. He walked there and verified that the noise came from an open faucet, which is why there was a puddle of water on the floor. He closed it and called loudly to his girlfriend. Rachel! He continued calling her with a trembling voice, waiting for an answer that didn't come. His head was filled with questions, but before he could find answers, a sound snapped him out of his daze. A voice boomed from the stairs. What's going on, Ben? It sounded like Rachel's voice, although it was one of the phrases that the creature had repeated in the living room, imitating his girlfriend. He had to check if she was there, if she was in danger. He looked towards the stairs and shouted, Rachel, where are you? Where's the box? But she stopped answering. Likewise, he decided to climb the stairs cautiously. His heart was beating so hard that it seemed like it would burst out of his mouth at any moment. When he reached the second floor hallway, he noticed another noise. He looked at the ground and saw how there was water there too. It seemed that there was another faucet open, the one in the bathroom. So he pointed the flashlight down and slowly made his way there. As he approached, he could see how the door was ajar. And the strangest thing was the bathroom switch was also broken. They had completely lifted the plastic of the button and had left the cables outside. He counted to 3 in his mind, and after taking a very deep breath, he gathered his courage and kicked open the bathroom door. There was no one there. Only the tap in the sink was open, causing the water to overflow and fall to the floor. He approached it and closed the faucet, but the noise of flowing water continued. There was one more tap that wasn't turned off. He could hear the sound of water coming from the bathtub, as if someone was taking a shower. He pushed aside the curtains to close it when suddenly he encountered horror. The man in the box, that unexplainable creature, was staring at him from inside. He stifled a scream of terror, covering his mouth with his hand as he backed away, pointing the flashlight at him. He remembered the instructions in the letter. He was not to look away. It was necessary so that he wouldn't move. Frightened, he walked backwards, but panic took hold of him. And in his desperation to flee, the flashlight slipped from his hands in the middle of the hallway and fell to the floor. His only salvation was to outrun that thing. He had to escape, so he headed towards the stairs. But something even more terrible awaited him. That thing in the bathroom was not the only one. With difficulty due to the poor lighting, he could see several shadows of creatures like those in the box climbing the stairs. He stared at them, and then the group stopped in their track and stood paralyzed. However, he had stopped eye contact with the man in the shower. He turned quickly and could see him behind him. That paralyzed their movement but allowed the group on the ladder to ascend a few more steps. They were surrounded. They couldn't maintain contact with both sides because they were in opposite areas. The creatures were getting closer, and he struggled to keep his gaze focused everywhere. It was an impossible task. Everything was even more complicated with almost no light. He could barely make out shadows. He needed the flashlight. The creature in the box continued walking until the young man paralyzed him again by looking back at him. But he had stayed next to the lantern. He was less than a step away from it. Ben couldn't catch it. Those on the stairs continued their ascent, and he turned constantly trying to escape, but finding himself cornered. The last thing he heard was the click of the flashlight.
Hello, horror lovers. Today we bring you a tragic love story in the same vein as Romeo and Juliet. The protagonists are Rosario and Joel, two teenagers who lived in Durango, Mexico. They knew each other since they were kids and became a couple while still in high school. On one school party, Joel gave Rosario an artificial rose. It was a symbol of love and commitment. And it wasn't in vain, because in the following years, they became closer than ever. They made a lot of plans together and dreamed about forming a beautiful family one day. They would become doctors, and their dream was to live in the countryside and have 2 children. Their families were delighted with their relationship, and everything looked like a fairy tale. Unfortunately, when they were about to finish university, Joel died in a car accident. Rosario was completely devastated. She spent many years mourning her loss and would always carry with her the artificial rose Joel had given her. However, her heartbreak healed over time, and she kept going on with her life. Then, years later, she met a man who made her fall in love again, Enrique. Although she always seemed hesitant about rebuilding her life, Enrique taught her that she could love again. They became a couple, and she started to feel happy again. However, every time Rosario looked at Joel's rose, the memories she shared with him would make her feel deeply sad. Thus, she had to turn the page and start over. And so, she decided to give Joel back his rose. One afternoon, she put it in her purse and went to the graveyard. She left it on top of Joel's grave, while she told him that she would never forget him, but she needed to move on. Enrique supported Rosario, and she felt better in the following days. She was very happy about being able to retake the path she had abandoned so many years ago. However, things wouldn't be so easy, and she would soon realize it. A month after she went to the graveyard, Rosario found Joel's artificial rose. Lying right on her bed, she felt a shiver go down her spine as soon as she saw it. Rosario was sure Enrique wouldn't do something so macabre. It was impossible he would dare to do such a thing, but she called him just in case. Sure enough, it wasn't him, and nobody else had copies of the keys to the apartment. She sat down for a while, looking at that artificial flower that brought her so many memories. And then she asked, as if thinking out loud, "What does this mean?" And suddenly she froze in horror as she heard someone say, "You promised you would be mine forever." The shock was too intense for Rosario's heart, who suffered a heart attack right there and then, dying instantly. It is said that when she was buried, she carried in her hands that artificial flower Joel had given her when they were still kids. And from then on, it was certain that their love would last forever. Many people don't believe that haunted houses are a real thing. They say that all those stories about spirits remaining in a particular physical space, terrorizing anyone who approaches that area, are nothing but fiction designed for entertainment or for scaring gullible people. Usually those spirits that remain in the zone between our world and the afterlife have a reason to be there. Something ties them to our reality, most likely some sort of goal or mission to fulfill. The intentions of those spirits depend on their particular goals, and also on the way they died. And the most dangerous spirits are the ones looking for revenge. Our story starts in the summer of 2005, starring the Tiga family. Its members could have never imagined everything that would happen to them, and if they did, they would have never moved. They decided to move to a different house when they noticed that their son, Fran, who would usually get excellent grades in all his exams, started to fail them. His parents didn't know what was happening, so they decided to observe him more closely. One day, the teenage boy said he was going to the park to play some soccer, but his mother followed him from a distance. Then she saw that he lied to them. The son got into a car with another group of young people who were infamous for causing trouble everywhere they went. When Fran arrived home that night, his mother was waiting for him in the living room. She was so angry that her screams were heard through the entire building. She was extremely worried about her son's future, so she decided that they would move out of there as soon as possible. Some had already warned her about how that neighborhood wasn't the best one to live in, but that's the only one the family could afford. The Tiga family was poor and survived on a single salary. The mother had been looking for a job for a long time, but all the jobs she could find offered extremely low salaries or had terrible work conditions. However, even though she wanted to accept any of those jobs, her husband would insist in waiting until she could get a better opportunity. Soon they called a real estate agency. When the family told them their budget, the agency told them that there were very few offers within that price range, and all of them were in areas which would be much worse for their son's development. They decided to stay where they were, although they would have to control Fran much more, so he wouldn't interact with bad people. However, 2 days later, the father received a call. A house became available near one of the country's best schools, and for an unusually low price. Soon after the family learned about this, they got in the car and went to visit the house to check it out and see if they would rent it. It was a long trip that lasted many months, and they almost had a car accident that would have taken their lives for sure. They were exhausted even though they stopped several times during the trip, but as soon as they saw the house's exterior, they all felt energetic once more. They knew that was the correct house because a woman was waiting for them at the front door to give them a guided tour. On the outside, the house was very well taken care of. It had 3 floors and a beautiful yard. They calculated that the rent should cost about 10 times what they were actually going to pay for it. On the inside, the house was even better. The wood of the banisters and floors seemed to be of very high quality, and all the rooms included luxurious furniture. The only problem was that the basement had suffered a flood a few years ago, so it was now inaccessible. The couple was in love with that house, even though Fran still preferred to live in their current house. And there was also the option of fixing the basement in the future. When they finally ended the tour, the guide asked them if they wanted to rent the house. At the same time, both the husband and wife enthusiastically said yes, and that they would start moving their belongings to their new house as soon as possible. The next day, a moving truck arrived in front of their current house, waiting for all their belongings to be loaded. They met with the previous landlord, gave him the keys, and drove away without missing in the slightest that place that they had spent so much of their lives in. School wouldn't start for another month, so Fran's parents knew he would feel lonely and bored during that time. So once they settled in their new house and rested for a while, the 3 of them went out to familiarize themselves with the neighborhood. They walked around the area and were amazed at all the luxurious cars and gardens they were seeing all around. Once the family came back, they noticed that their front door was open. They thought it could be some sort of prank. It made no sense that on their first day there, burglars would break into their house when there were fancier houses to rob in that neighborhood. But unfortunately, it was not a prank. Whoever broke in left the living room a complete mess, but didn't steal anything. The family then called a locksmith to reinforce their front door. The locksmith changed the lock, but warned the family that the door had not been forced open, so they had to be careful about who they gave copies of the new keys to. That very night, Fran had a nightmare where an old man with his clothes covered in blood ripped out his own head in front of him. Then, paralyzed in fear, Fran observed how the decapitated man walked towards his parents and then murdered them brutally. He woke up with his heart racing and drenched in so much sweat that he took a few minutes before noticing that he actually peed the bed. And despite how embarrassed he felt, he still went to look for his mother. When he told her what happened, she hugged and comforted him. She told him that it was just a nightmare, and that he could take his bed sheets and sleep in the living room. Fran did so, although he slept with the light of a small lamp on. The next day, Fran was noticeably tired, and his entire body ached, especially his neck. He tried to not give it importance, and assumed it was due to sleeping on the sofa. He had breakfast and went to his room to change his bed sheets. However, as he was going up the stairs, he saw something strange on the hall's mirror, and when he looked at it more closely, he froze in shock. Instead of his reflection, he saw the same old decapitated man from his nightmare. Fran turned around and yelled to the top of his lungs, pleading for help. The mirror then fell to the floor on its own, breaking into thousands of tiny shards. Fran's parents rushed upstairs, and after seeing that their son was fine, they grabbed a broom and started to sweep off the shards. The father was the one who threw all the mirror shards in the garbage, but noticed that some of the fragments were stained with something. He inspected them more closely and noticed that they had blood on them, even though Fran didn't have a single wound on his body. A couple of weeks later, Fran's first day of school finally came. His mother prepared a special breakfast for him, so he would leave home feeling happy. He ate it but didn't feel much hunger due to the nervousness. He then finished getting ready and put on his backpack. And once Fran was going out the front door, a black cat holding something in its mouth suddenly appeared in front of him. The cat quickly approached Fran, left what it was holding by his feet, and rushed to the yard and beyond. The teenage boy, barely understanding what just happened, looked to the ground and saw the little gift the cat had left him, a dead crow. Scared, Fran rushed back home crying, looking for his mom once more. However, when the mother went out to verify what her son was saying, she found nothing outside. It's as if the dead crow vanished into thin air. She got mad, thinking he wanted to miss his first day of school. Then she grabbed the keys of her car and ordered Fran to get into the vehicle. She scolded her son on the way to school, and when they arrived, she waited for her son to go in to make sure he wouldn't try to miss school. At least Fran would make new friends that day. The teacher knew a student would arrive and wanted to help him out by making him introduce himself to his classmates, and he was well liked from the very first moment. During the half-hour recess, Fran spent that time with the group of teens that always got the best grades. He finally felt that he fit in and could have many different conversations with them. With his old group, they only talked about doing bad things and screwing other people over. Everything was going great until they asked Fran where he was living now. He happily responded without imagining the group would react the way they did. They were all petrified in shock. Little Fran Tiga didn't understand their reaction and asked them what was happening. The group told him that there were rumors about his house being a haunted house. It seems that the previous family man who had lived there was possessed by a demon and murdered his entire family. He then locked himself in the basement and let the water run until it became flooded and he drowned. When school ended for the day, Fran quickly returned to his new home and told his mother what he heard in school. But she didn't believe him, and that only made her angrier. First you break a mirror, and now you do everything you can to make us believe that our house is haunted? As much as you miss your good-for-nothing friends, we won't let you ruin your own future. Fran started crying, feeling completely helpless. His mother didn't believe him, since he had lied to her a few times in the past. He locked himself in his room and continued crying until he fell asleep. A few hours later, he was woken up by strange noises. Worried, he went out of his room and bumped into his parents, who were also hearing those sounds. They seemed to be coming from the living room. The mother and father slowly went down the stairs, expecting to find a burglar in the living room. Once they got there, they discovered that the noises were coming from behind the door leading to the basement. It seemed that something was hitting it from the inside. The father tried to force open the lock, but it was futile. He even tried to break open the door by kicking it with all his might, but to no avail. Whatever seemed to be hitting the door eventually stopped, and the couple went back upstairs in fear. They didn't want to worry Fran, so they told him that they forgot to close a window, and the wind knocked down some of the furniture in the living room. Soon after, when the mother went into her room and turned on the lights, she couldn't avoid screaming when she saw a terrifying message painted on the bed's headboard: "Get out of my house." They called the police and explained to them what happened, but when she was telling the home address to the agent who answered the call, the agent immediately hung up. Dumbfounded, the three members of the Tiga family looked at each other. What were they going to do now? They spent all of their savings money there. Suddenly, they heard a window break, making them understand that their top priority was to escape. They rushed out of the room, but unfortunately, Fran slipped and fell on the glass shards of the window that broke, stabbing him all over his body. The father worriedly helped him remove the glass shards lodged on his skin, and as he helped his son, the family perceived a strong burning smell. They turned around and saw how smoke was coming out of the only exit in the lower floor. They quickly went downstairs, praying that the flames wouldn't be near the entrance. But when they reached the last step, a column of fire blocked their path, preventing them from escaping. They were surrounded by fire, and their only way to escape now was to go down to the basement. The father hit the lock with all his might, managing to break it. He opened the door, and from the basement a hideous stench of rotting flesh came out, which made them all gag. Time was running out, so they went down to the basement regardless. They carefully went down the stairs, illuminated by the light of the fire behind them. And when they reached the bottom, they noticed that some water was still left from the previous flood. Then the door behind them slammed shut on its own. Now the Tiga family could only pray for the fire to not burn the door, and for them to survive until it all ended. Also, the stench in the basement was so horrible that they struggled trying not to throw up. A few moments later, they started to hear a voice. It was such a deep and sinister voice that it might as well have been the voice of the devil himself. The voice said they all made a terrible mistake invading his house, and would pay for not going away when they could. The family then heard a metallic sound. It was the sound of a water valve opening. They saw how the liquid started to quickly come out of a tube, and with such a strong pressure that it was impossible to approach the tube to block it. The water level started to rise. There were no windows, so it was just a matter of time before they all drowned. And when the water was covering their necks, the father felt how something grabbed his ankle and tried to sink him. As much as Fran and his mother tried to help him, that being was pulling him so strongly that it ended up sinking him. A few seconds later he drowned, and his body got lost in the depths of the room. After that, Fran and his mother were hugging, horrified, pleading to God to save them. But suddenly, the mother screamed in pain. Fran saw how the water started to become red, and witnessed how his mother lost all of her remaining strength, letting go of Fran. When little Fran finally accepted that he was going to die, the basement's door opened. All he could distinguish as his eyes closed was a firefighter uniform. Fran fell unconscious, but was rescued and woke up the next day. The rescue team had to wait for the water to drain in order to search for the bodies of the parents. However, they got a nasty surprise when they discovered that there was another body there. It was in an advanced stage of decomposition, as if it had been there for a long time. The father had teeth marks on his ankle, coming from an unknown creature. Meanwhile, one of the mother's legs had been bitten right off. The other body was holding a Bible. When opened, the book had all of its pages blank, except behind the cover where something was written. It was extremely difficult to decipher what it said, so writing experts had to be brought in to analyze it. It was a confession. The original family man who lived there, who was 57 years old back then, had fallen in love with the house. However, his family said they could not continue paying for it, that it was way too expensive for them, that it was best to look for a cheaper one. The man refused vehemently. As the months passed, they were sinking more and more into debt, until the wife told him during an argument that she was no longer willing to live like that she would leave and would take the children with her. The family man, possessed by the demon that made him fall in love with that house, murdered his entire family. He then took his own life by locking himself in the basement and letting it get flooded until he finally drowned.
Have you ever been afraid of using public transport at night? You can find terrible things there early in the morning, from drunkards going back home from a party to muggers who will try to steal your phone and wallet. However, what I saw that one time on the bus was much more terrifying. My name is Monica, and I work the night shift at a call center. It's not the best job out there, but I live alone, I have bills to pay, and it's the best job I've found so far. I remember that this happened on a Friday because I saw people partying in the streets, which wasn't very amusing since I had to work that weekend. My office is located at the outskirts of the city, but fortunately there is a bus route that leaves me near my house. I waited for my bus alone in the dark like I usually do. I didn't care since I was used to it. Once the bus arrived, I went and sat at one of the middle seats near a guy who seemed to be a university student. He was listening to music and checking his notes. Apart from the driver, there was nobody else there and everything was silent. But then, 4 or 5 stops later, when we were going through an industrial neighborhood, 3 men got on the bus. They caught my attention because they were dragging another man from his shoulders. He was looking down and his hair covered his face. I assumed they were coming back from a party and that the guy they were dragging was so drunk he couldn't stand up. Although I found it weird for them to be in that area since there were no bars nor nightclubs there. They walked through the bus without looking at anybody, then dropped their friend on one of the seats in the back and sat by his side. Nobody else got on the bus for the rest of the route, and I couldn't stop thinking about those men. I had a bad feeling about them. I looked at them over my shoulder, and I saw how the head of the drunk guy jumped from one side to the other out of control after each turn and bounce the bus made. One of the men saw me, glared at me threateningly, and thus I looked away immediately. However, curiosity was killing me. I thought about taking my makeup mirror out of my purse. I pretended to look at it, but I was actually using it to look at where the drunk guy was. When I took a better look at him, I realized he looked very pale, but I assumed that was due to the alcohol too. The bus bounced again due to a pothole, and the drunk guy's hair was pushed away, revealing his face. I froze in shock after seeing his eyes, completely opened and features looking. He was looking directly at me without any reaction. But what impacted me the most was his facial expression, which showed pure horror. I turned around a bit and saw that the same man as before was looking at me again. He realized what I was doing with my mirror. I immediately closed it, trying to play dumb, and held my breath. I didn't dare to look back and only wanted to get home. And suddenly I felt a hand on my shoulder and looked up in fear. It was the university student with a worried expression, making a gesture to get off the bus at the next stop with him. I obeyed without thinking it twice. I really wanted to get out of there. Once the bus went away, the student confirmed my worst fear. He was actually a medicine student, and the guy those men were dragging around had all the signs of rigor mortis. Rigid body, purplish hands, and glassy eyes. He wasn't drunk, he was dead. We called the police and gave a description of the three men, and that was the last time I ever got into a bus. With the few savings I had, I bought a second-hand car. After the sudden death of her son, Vicky had fallen into a deep depression. Her husband, Carl, tried to help her recover, encouraged her to seek professional help, but she clung to her pain as if it were her only comfort. Her life had come to a standstill the same day that cancer had taken her little one from her. One day, while searching for entertainment on the internet, Vicky saw a very strange advertisement. It promised a solution to their despair, a special doll that could bring back the memories and presence of deceased people. She closed the page, cursing how much people took advantage of painful situations for financial gain. However, something had stirred her inside. What would that doll do? Would they make them like people, and could they ease the pain of missing someone? The truth was that since the incorporation of artificial intelligence into today's life, anything was possible, even creating identical digital people. It could be something to do with her assumptions, and they didn't seem so crazy to her anymore. So she grabbed her cell phone, searched for the ad again, and contacted the seller. He assured her that the doll was more than just a toy. It would have the energy and memories of her son. So it's just a doll? She thought. It didn't inspire much confidence. But desperate to feel her son's presence again, she accepted the seller's fee to begin the creation process. When she mentioned it to her husband, he showed his discontent. "Please, Vicky, don't you see that they're taking advantage of you? A doll? But are you hearing yourself? I know it's hard, it's been hard for me too, but you have to start accepting reality. Jake is gone, honey." The woman began to cry uncontrollably. She was short of breath, she had a new anxiety crisis. The husband knew that he shouldn't encourage her to move on, but he couldn't bear to see her suffer like this. He would do anything to get his wife out of that hole full of sadness. So he promised her that he would support her in purchasing that doll. The seller asked the woman for several items. Photos, objects that the child always carried with him or that were very precious to him, clothes that retained their smell and that had not been washed, and several more elements. Vicky had everything he needed, and as important objects for the little one, she would give him his baseball glove. He loved to play and wore it all the time. That same day, she paid him half of the order and sent him all the items that were needed. She wanted to have that doll as soon as possible. Days later, the seller showed up at their house with a large box. Vicky received him nervously and asked the merchant to go down to the basement. They went down the stairs and the woman turned on the lights. It was a spacious place, with boxes full of the little boy's objects. The parents had not found enough strength to get rid of them. The seller placed the box on a large table. Meanwhile, Carl watched them with a disapproving face, sitting on the stairs. Vicky, with a broken voice, asked him if that would really work. The man, with a big smile, replied that no one had ever asked him to return the money. Carl shook his head, regretting that he had let someone rip them off at their house. She watched expectantly as the seller carefully opened the box. Inside, wrapped in delicate paper, was a doll. As if he were presenting a treasure, he asked the woman to look inside. There was a doll of poor quality. It seemed to be made of rags. It didn't look anything like the child. You could only recognize his clothes and his baseball glove on his hand. The salesman was waiting for Vicky's impression, who still hadn't said a word. Then he asked her what she thought, but it wasn't her who answered, but Carl. "I'm gonna tell you what I think. It seems to me that you have laughed at the wrong family. You should be ashamed of taking advantage of other people's misfortunes. Did you charge us that much money for a rag doll? I thought you would try harder." Carl was about to throw that man out of the house when suddenly he saw his wife smiling while holding the doll in her arms. A tear fell as he heard the sound of her laughter again. He didn't understand anything, but Vicky was happy hugging and talking to that rag doll. "Oh, Jake, I've missed you so much, honey." Carl couldn't understand anything. The seller didn't ignore his expression of uncertainty and encouraged him to hold the doll in his arms. He looked again at his wife, who was tearfully kissing that piece of cloth, and with distrust, he grabbed the cloth hand. Suddenly, he could see his son in his wife's arms. It was him! His little hands, his smell, his hair. Is it Jake?" Carl asked. The salesman nodded. Yes, it's him. All his memories, his energy are inside this doll. When he released his son's hand, the man again saw his wife hugging the rag doll. She was very excited. She couldn't stop smiling. But that didn't inspire confidence in him. He had serious doubts that this would help his wife face the child's death. He asked Vicky to leave the doll in the box and they could talk about it privately. But his wife didn't even want to listen to him. She took out of her pocket the envelope that contained the other half of the money she owed the seller and thanked him for that creation. Before leaving, the merchant told them that they should talk about the instruction manual for that doll. He told them that their house was the place where his little one's spiritual imprint had been left. The essence of his former being remained there, and that doll was a container to channel all that energy. "Only in this house? What happens if we go somewhere else with him?" Vicky asked worriedly. The seller made a sign to her with his hand, inviting her to go out into the street with a little one in her arms. They left the basement, and as soon as they crossed the entrance door, she was alerted to see that she was hugging a piece of cloth again. She got scared, and the man explained that outside of their home, Jake was just a doll. The woman went inside with him again, worried and alarmed. But she breathed a sigh of relief when she saw that her little one was hugging her neck again. Carl closed his eyes as he placed his hands on his face in disapproval. Then he looked at the seller and asked how many more warnings there were. The man answered that there was only one. He put his hand in the pocket of his jacket and showed him a small hourglass. Placing it in front of his eyes while the sand passed from the upper side to the lower side, he warned him that they shouldn't spend more time than it took for all the sand to fall from one side to the other with him. When time was up, they had to put him in his box for a whole day. And until that whole day had passed, they weren't to take him out again. That indication intrigued Carl, so he asked him what would happen if they didn't comply with that rule. The salesman replied, "My product is like an addiction, pleasant but dangerous if abused. If you don't follow this rule, you will lose control. You will believe the lie. You will believe that the doll is real, and after a while, you won't even have to touch it for the illusion to work. You will always see it as a normal human being. You will forget about the cancer that took your son. You'll even forget that you hired me. Your mind will bury what it doesn't need and fill those spaces to keep the lie alive." Of course, if any of this happens, I'm not responsible. You've been warned. Carl stared at his wife, who was laughing and hugging that piece of fabric. He was worried about what would happen if she didn't follow the rules. If she would be able to leave that doll in the box for a whole day. Having the feeling of recovering their little one again was very dangerous. But at that moment, he knew he had no options. She was too excited. Time passed, and Carl saw how that doll had seriously affected Vicky's mental health. She didn't pay attention to anything or anyone other than that piece of cloth. She didn't care about never leaving the house again, interacting with more people. Everything she needed was with her. It had been a while since she had turned the hourglass, and she refused to leave the Jake doll in the place the seller had indicated. She dedicated her entire day to feeding him purees and playing with him. She spoke to him as if he were her real son, completely ignoring the reality around her. She didn't comb her hair, she didn't shower, it had become an obsession. Meanwhile, Carl, increasingly worried, tried to convince her to get rid of the doll, but she flatly refused. Just as the seller had said, she no longer needed to touch the doll to be able to see it alive. She didn't remember that this was the result of an illusion. One morning, very early, her husband found her in the living room, singing lullabies to the doll while swinging it in her arms. He asked her if she had been up all night, but she pretended not to hear him and continued rocking her baby while humming. Carl reminded her of the words he had said to her after their son's funeral. He told her that life could sometimes be cruel, but that everyone has the strength within to be able to overcome the difficulties of life. However, he felt like he had lost her. Carl began to cry, and Vicky stopped her rocking and singing and stared piercingly at her husband. Carl was devastated. He couldn't continue with that situation. He looked at his wife and told her that they should face this problem together. But she looked at him with empty eyes. She was completely lost in her delirium. One afternoon, as Carl was getting out of the shower, he heard laughter coming from the room. His wife was sitting on the floor, hugging the doll and muttering incoherent words. Carl approached slowly, trying to bring his wife back to reality, but when he tried to take the doll out of her hands, she reacted furiously, screaming and scratching him as if she were a wild cat. Then he understood that that doll hadn't brought comfort to his wife, but rather an even deeper darkness, which consumed her day by day. He was trapped in a nightmare, not knowing if he would be able to get his wife back or if that doll had taken her sanity forever. Once again, he insisted to his wife that she should stay away from the doll for a while, but she refused. "It's not a doll, he's my son!" Carl sighed and asked again to put Jake in his box, although he knew that she wouldn't. She turned around and hugged her son again, speaking to him as if Carl had already left there. Then the man, very nervous, grabbed her by the arm and made her follow him to the front door. She tried to free herself while holding her little boy tightly in her arms. The woman began to scream and cry inconsolably, asking him not to do it, not to hurt her little Jake. Then, just before she walked through the door, he told her, "Vicky, I'm just going to take you outside so you can see what you really have in your arms." Right after, the man went outside and noticed how his hands were released from the fabric of his wife's dress. It was no longer her, but a doll who had her son's doll in her arms. Carl started to shake. He couldn't understand anything. Why his wife had fallen apart and turned into a piece of rag? Then images began to come to his mind. The moments in which his wife began to lose her mind over their son's doll. She had lost her mind, and although he had tried to help her, it had not been possible. Since she didn't listen to reason, Carl decided to put an end to the situation and hit the doll. Vicky kept insisting, asking him to give her son back, but he remained firm. It broke his heart to see how his wife suffered, but that doll had made her lose her mind. He had to put an end to that false illusion that their son was with her again. However, Vicky could not stand it. She had lost the person she loved most twice, and her life stopped making sense. She sank into darkness and ended up in the same cemetery as her little boy. After his wife's death, Carl went to see the seller again, demanding an explanation. That doll had ended his wife's trial and ultimately her life. The man replied, "I told you it wouldn't be my responsibility, friend. I explained the rules to you, you just had to comply with the instructions." Carl, desperate, asked him to bring her back. Vicky was his reason for life. Without her, nothing made sense. His love for her was the only thing that had made him continue fighting after his son's death. "Well, I'll need some photos, her unwashed clothes, and some valuable objects of hers." The salesman's words echoed in his head as Carl returned to reality and looked at the doll on the floor dressed in his wife's clothes. The illusion of seeing her alive had made him forget everything, even his own death. He didn't remember hiring the doll maker again, desperate to have Vicky back in his arms. He grabbed the doll and hugged it with tears in his eyes. Then he took her back inside the house, where the cloth turned back into skin, and his wife returned with him. "I'm so sorry, darling. I won't do it again. I won't take you out of the house again. I will stay with you always, I promise." Meanwhile, on the living room table, there were the 2 hourglasses that the seller had given him, and both were broken, with the sand scattered. "Help! Help! Can anyone hear me? Get me out of here! Help!" 1 week before, Megan was enjoying her last month at home with her sister Amy and mother, before moving 1,000 kilometers away, because she would go to study at one of the best universities. Although she was sad to be separated from her family and friends, she was very excited to have gotten a place at one of the most prestigious centers. She had worked hard during her teens to get good grades, and she could finally see how her efforts were rewarded. One of the things that also saddened her was the idea of ending her relationship with Josh. They had met 3 months ago, and although she liked him, she felt that it was better that they put their relationship on hold for a while. They would be very far from each other, and she preferred to end their short courtship so she could focus on her studies. So, sure of her decision, she met Josh one afternoon. They spent the first few hours chatting and eating ice cream. Then Megan gathered her courage and started talking about her move. However, Josh paused his speech by telling her that he had thought about it a lot and had made a decision. He would move to the same city as her, so they could see each other every day. The young woman didn't know what to say. Those last few months had been good, but she didn't feel like their relationship would last either. Besides, Josh was 9 years older than her and had a job there. She didn't want to be forced to have to meet him every day. She wasn't even sure if she saw a future in the relationship, so she told him that she wanted to stop the relationship. Josh's response wasn't what was expected. He began to adopt a possessive and macho attitude towards her, and that made her even more confident that she had made the right decision. She walked home, and on the way, she decided to call Nick, her best friend. He was the only one who knew the relationship. She hadn't dared to tell her family. They would be scandalized if they knew that she was dating a boy 9 years older than her. But that was already a thing of the past. When she got home, Mike arrived with a car. Mike was her mother's ex-husband. They had been divorced for 3 years, but still had a good relationship. He had always treated the girls as if they were his daughters, so they still spent a lot of time together. That day, he was going to have dinner with the 3 women, and when he saw Megan alone in the street at that time, he got worried. She told him that she had been late with a friend, but that everything was fine and the two went home. While they were having dinner, the man asked Megan why not choose a closer university. He didn't want her to go so far. He had a strong paternal feeling towards her, and he liked to see her often. Meanwhile, her cell phone kept vibrating. Her mother asked her who was calling her so insistently, and she lied, saying it was her friend Nick, asking her about a party some friends were having the next day. When she grabbed her phone, she could see 20 missed calls and several messages from Josh. At first with a pleading tone, and the last with an aggressive and threatening tone. He insulted her for having used him for a few months and then abandoned him. The young woman blew and turned off her cell phone. She didn't want to keep thinking about the same. Before leaving, Mike once again insisted on changing universities. "Oh, come on, Megan. Studying here isn't that bad. I've done it, and look how well it has gone for me. The mother replied with a laugh. If that's your way of convincing her, I see you very bad. You have just run out of options. The next day, Megan went to the party with Nick. What she didn't know was that this was a surprise farewell party. Several friends from class had gone to have a good time together. The young woman danced and chatted with everyone. At one of those moments, Nick hugged her and told her that he really wanted to tell her something. She squeezed him tightly, and before he continued, she told him that he was the best friend she had ever had and that she didn't want distance or anyone to spoil their beautiful friendship. Nick then changed his expression to a shy smile and replied that what he wanted to tell her was exactly the same. Although inside, he was screaming at himself for not being able to confess his love. At one point, Megan saw a shadow move outside the window. It seemed like someone was spying on them. She got nervous and went outside to see who it was. Meanwhile, everyone continued dancing and singing inside the house. Nick noticed her absence and asked one of the girls if she knew where she was. She told him that she had seen her leave and she hadn't come back in. So Nick went outside to look for her. The next day, her mother and sister got up and had breakfast together. Shortly after, Mike arrived with churros for everyone. Oh, stop it, Mike, the mother told him. If you keep bringing us sweets, we won't get through the door. The woman asked her daughter to go wake up her sister. And shortly after, Amy returned to the kitchen saying that Megan hadn't returned. The bed was intact. That wasn't like Megan. She always let her mother know if she didn't spend the night at home. The woman began to get nervous, but Mike assured her that everything was fine. Surely the party had dragged on and everyone had fallen asleep. He called one of their friends and asked her about the young woman. She was at her house and told her that Megan had left the party and hadn't returned. That plunged the family into a nervous breakdown. Mike offered to go to the police and hospitals in case something had happened to her. Meanwhile, the two women would stay at home in case the young woman returned. Minutes later, Megan's friend called her mother. She told her that she remembered seeing Nick leave after Megan and that he hadn't returned either. Amy had his number and called him immediately, but he didn't answer the call. Shortly after, he wrote to her on WhatsApp telling her that he was on a train trip with his parents and that he couldn't talk, only send messages. The sister asked him when he had last seen Megan, and he replied that he had seen her leave, and when he couldn't find her, he had gone home. All of that was very strange. The mother and sister were shaken, thinking that something could have happened to the young woman. When Mike returned from the police, he had Megan's cell phone with him. He had passed by the street where the party had been organized and had found the young woman's phone on the ground. Amy knew her password, so she was able to unlock it. As she did so, she saw dozens of missed calls and messages from Josh. They didn't know anything about the relationship, but those messages showed controlling behavior towards Megan. After she asked him to leave her alone and they had broken up, the three looked at each other. Would that boy be capable of doing something to the young woman for leaving him? They had to inform the police and have the authorities look for him to find out Megan's whereabouts. 48 hours had already passed without hearing anything from the young woman. The police continued to work with the information that the family had provided, but assured them that it was still too early to consider it a disappearance. The inspector insisted several times, asking if Megan had any enemies or boyfriends she could have run away with. The mother and sister assured her that if she had left without warning, it would have been against her will. Suddenly, a message rang on Amy's cell phone. It was from Nick, and it said, "Okay, Amy, we didn't want to tell you yet because Megan didn't know how to do it. But we went to Las Vegas. We are in love and we want to spend some time together disconnecting." Neither the mother nor Amy had bought that lie. They knew Megan well. She would never leave like that. When Mike arrived and they told him, the man was thoughtful. What if it is him? He doesn't answer calls, he just writes messages. And you can't deny that you haven't realized that he's madly in love with her. If it's not Nick, it's Josh, I'm sure. The clock hands continued their rhythm and 48 more hours had already passed. The mother cried in the kitchen, wondering where her daughter was. Suddenly, a call on her cell phone. It was the police inspector. They had found Megan's car 100 kilometers from her house. He asked the mother to come to the location he would send her by message. Mother and daughter drove to the indicated point by car. They were shaken, wondering why they hadn't been told anything more. What were they going to find? Upon arrival, there was a large deployment of police. That didn't seem like the vehicle had been the only thing found. There was something else. The inspector asked Amy to stay in the car and then asked her mother to accompany him alone. He warned her that what she would say would be very unpleasant, but they needed her help to continue their investigation. The woman swallowed and hyperventilated while the man opened the trunk door. At that moment, the mother screamed at the top of her lungs, alerting her daughter, who immediately got out of the car to see what was happening. Inside the trunk was the body of Nick, Megan's best friend. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. Nick hadn't gone anywhere with her, nor was he kidnapping her. Someone had his phone and pretended to be him to make all suspicions directed towards the young man. Could it all have been the work of Megan's ex-boyfriend? They had to find out. The next morning, the mother wanted to search her cell phone for information about Josh, his social networks, school information. She wanted to know more information about him. Her phone ran out of battery, so she grabbed Mike's phone while he was in the bathroom. It wasn't very difficult to find his password. He always used the same one for everything since they had met. When she unlocked it, she saw something strange. She wasn't sure if it was a video or what. It was dark and a person could be seen from behind. Suddenly, the person turned around and realized what she was saying. It was a vision of a camera and it was recording Megan. She didn't have time to react. Suddenly, Mike hit her on the head and she fell unconscious. When she opened her eyes, she was in an empty room with her mouth covered and her hands tied to a chair. She had it in front of her all that time. Mike was her daughter's kidnapper. Her only relief was to have seen her alive. That meant there was still some chance of meeting her again. The man began to tell her that she wasn't worrying about her daughter. If she went to study so far away, many people could take advantage of her. Megan had to stay with them. They are family. Then he also talked to her about Nick. He wasn't a bad guy, but of course he saw me when I took her away and he wanted to be the hero. So he left me no choice but to kill him. Collateral damage. The truth is that this was good for me to confuse the police a little and keep them away from here. But that damn inspector was able to find the car, and I bothered to leave it quite far away. And I can't forget about Josh's idiot. He was obsessed with Megan and I had to eliminate him from the map too. He gave nothing but problems. The mother tried to scream, but the tape on her mouth prevented her from doing so. The man she had shared half her life with was a murderer and a kidnapper. Mike left her alone while he prepared a snack for Megan. The mother was kicking, trying to free herself from the chair when suddenly she saw hands trying to open the window. It was her daughter Amy. She had followed them and had just discovered what Mike had done. The mother motioned for her daughter to leave and call the police. The young woman called the emergency services, but she couldn't let him hurt her sister and mother. She would figure out a way to get in without being seen. Shortly after, Mike returned to the room where he had gagged the mother and asked her if she wanted them to go visit her daughter. The mother, with pleading eyes and nodding her head, asked him to do so. Okay, you will see our daughter one last time. I know she will be happy, but be very careful about doing stupid things. The man released her from the chair and tied her hands together again behind her back, pushing her towards the basement. When he opened the door, Megan launched herself into her mother's arms. The two cried when they saw each other. The man left a tray with 2 juices and 2 sandwiches on a table. He gave one to Megan and left the other for the mother. He told them that he was leaving them alone for a few minutes so they could talk. When he left, the mother assured her daughter that they would get out of there, but Megan put her finger on her mother's lips. Shh, he's always listening, Mom. The young woman drank all the juice that Mike had given her in one gulp. Her mother, seeing her so thirsty, told her that she could drink hers too. She had recently eaten and was neither hungry nor thirsty. Megan thanked her and grabbed her mother's glass when suddenly Mike slapped her hands, sending the glass to the floor. The 2 women screamed in fright. Afterwards, the man grabbed the mother by the neck while screaming at her. That juice was for you! You were about to kill our daughter! You only deserve to die. You're not capable of keeping her safe even here. Megan lay on top of Mike and tried to stop him, but he resisted. The young woman didn't stop trying to stop him when suddenly, the man hit her trying to get rid of her. Megan fell against the wall and began to bleed from her eyebrow. Then Mike left the mother aside and bent down to see the young woman's wound. He was gently brushing the hair out of her face when a blow to the head caused him to fall on the ground. It was Amy. She had managed to sneak through a window and hit Mike in the head with all her might with a rolling pin. That only gave them a few seconds advantage. The blow would keep him for a very short time, just enough to escape from there. Quickly, the sisters tried to untie the mother's hands and escape towards the door. But just when they were in the hallway, they could hear Mike's voice behind them. The door was locked. They couldn't get out of there. They would have to get out through a window. The mother pushed her daughters to jump out of the window first, and just as she was about to get out, the man grabbed her by the hair and threw her back inside. The two sisters screamed for help. They yelled at the men to let go of their mother. And suddenly, in total silence, the man let go of the woman and raised his hands. The police had arrived and were pointing their guns at him from outside. 2 murders, a kidnapping, and an attempted murder. No one would save him from prison. It was her first day at her new school. She walked through the front door with 1,000 eyes on her back, but she was sure of herself, so she stomped down the long hallway to her classroom. Helena had moved to town that summer. Her father was a bank manager, and after a readjustment in his company, he had been assigned a job 230 kilometers from home. In general, the move had not gone down well with the family, who had lived in the same house for more than 20 years. Helena, on the other hand, was happy. She liked a challenge. It was her last year of high school, and she would have to work twice as hard to get good grades. And she was sure she would. She wanted to be a computer engineer to create video games. That was her other great passion. That's why she walked into class so determined. She was sure of herself and wasn't afraid of anything. Her classmates were watching her and whispering, but she expected that. So she went in, sat in the front row, and waited patiently for the teacher to enter. They all knew each other. The town was small, so most of them had been studying together all their lives. So shortly after the teacher began, she asked Helena to introduce herself. She, without hesitation, stood up, said her name, and explained the reason for her transfer. After that, the teacher started the class immediately. At first, no classmate approached her. She wasn't worried, but she got bored during breaks, so she tried to approach a couple of girls who seemed nice to her. They were friendly and answered her questions, but when they saw an opportunity, they ran away. So she began to spend her breaks in the computer classroom. There, she found a sort of a quiet place where she could have fun with her video games or study. No one bothered her. As the days went by, her routine became established. Her classmates were still not integrating her, but she already had her usual friends, and now she had found a hobby for the dead hours, so she didn't care. It was strange to her that despite being very well equipped, practically no one went to that classroom. Some classmates came to print out papers, but they were never there for more than 5 or 10 minutes. She wanted to ask them, but since none of them came to her, she decided not to. One afternoon, while she was playing Minecraft, she thought she saw 2 girls reflected on the screen who seemed to be at the back of the class. She turned quickly but saw no one and regretted having lost her attention. She had lost the game. But history repeated itself over the next few days. If it wasn't the screen, it was her hand mirror. If it wasn't the mirror, it was a crystal. Those 2 girls appeared constantly. They were so alike that Helena immediately deduced that they were twins. But was it just her imagination? She had never believed in anything paranormal, but she was starting to get scared. It had been several days of believing she was seeing the same thing. That threw her off her studies. She couldn't sleep and needed to find answers. She wanted to approach some of her classmates, but as soon as she mentioned the subject, they left and did not answer her questions. She also stopped going to the computer classroom, spending her break sitting on a bench in the courtyard. When she stopped going there, she also stopped seeing those two girls for a few days. But the nightmare was not over. One night, she dreamt that she was washing her face in the bathroom and they appeared in the mirror. With hardly any time to react, one of them grabbed her hands and set her on fire in the curtains. They were killing her. But just at the last moment, she woke up and realized that it was just a dream. That night, she could not sleep anymore. She was afraid to close her eyes and see them again. Her parents started to worry. She had dark circles under her eyes, she was always sad, and her grades were dropping. She decided she couldn't go on like that, so she started to investigate tragic events with twins. And without much effort, she found them. On the second webpage she consulted, she recognized them. It was them, the same ones she had seen in that classroom. The news said that they had died in a fire at the school 70 years ago. The case was relatively recent, and although at the time she knew who they were, she did not understand why she could see them. Finding that answer took more time, and the weeks were really complicated. The twins had crept into her dreams. She could no longer sleep or do anything else. There was a rumor at school that she was possessed, and her classmates stayed away from her as if she had the plague. And since the town was small, it didn't take long for the priest to appear. He showed up one night at her house telling her parents that Helena needed an exorcism, or else she would die. He told her that she had invaded the space of two souls and now they wanted her dead. Her parents kicked him out, but deep down they did not know what to make of what was happening to her. They visited several psychologists and psychiatrists, but none of them worked. And things were getting worse as Helena did not sleep. She began to have hallucinations. The few times she closed her eyes, she did really strange things. She would walk around the house saying strange things, lie down on the floor, or break different objects. She was totally desperate, so she decided to go back to that classroom. She took advantage of the end of classes to sneak back in. She sat down on a chair and waited to see them again. It didn't take long for them to show up, and then she faced them. She asked them what they wanted from her, why they were following her. But no one answered. And suddenly she started to smell something burning. She looked sideways and one of the computers was smoking. Soon the flames started. She felt very scared, so she quickly went to the door to call for help. But she couldn't even get it open. It was completely blocked. The smoke soon began to flood everything and she was slowly losing consciousness. She fainted as she heard the fire alarm. Firefighters managed to rescue her with major burns over 50% of her body. No one could explain the cause of the fire, although in reality, everyone knew what had happened. Helena managed to recover from her physical injuries, but never from the psychological ones. She stopped seeing the twins, but her parents left town and the computer classroom was closed forever. There are many legends that originate from Latin America, and we love them. So today, we'll go to Mexico to tell you the legend of the Devil's Casino. Have you ever heard about it? It all happened in the city of Hermosillo, Sonora, in the 50s. There lived a girl named Linda. Like all other young people in the city, she looked forward to go to the big New Year's party, which would be celebrated at the casino for the wealthiest families in the city. Linda had planned everything. She would wear a precious dress, her white shoes, and a beautiful hairstyle. She dressed up with the utmost care and spent many hours getting ready. Once she was ready, Linda looked at herself in the mirror and couldn't believe what she saw. The big day had arrived and she looked beautiful. When she was ready to go, she went to say goodbye to her mother. However, Linda's mother, who had been sick for years, forbid her from going to that party. Linda's father supported his wife's decision and the young girl felt completely devastated. She spent a good while crying in her room and cursing her family. However, being 16 years old, she didn't just accept that no for an answer and decided to escape through her window. Then, as soon as she arrived to the party, everyone's attention turned to her. She looked beautiful and many boys approached her to have a dance with her, but she rejected them all. Until far away, she saw a very handsome boy who caught her attention. He had black hair, gorgeous green eyes, and was wearing a very elegant suit. Nobody knew who he was, but he soon approached Linda. He asked her for a dance, and she quickly accepted. Together, they went to the dance hall while everyone looked at them. However, a few minutes later, she noticed something strange. For some reason, the hand of the boy was burning her back. She'd never felt something like that before. How could it be possible? That burning sensation increased so much that she couldn't help but let out a cry and back away. That's when she saw the feet of that mysterious boy. One was a rooster's foot and the other one was a goat's foot. All the guests were speechless at that sight and the boy then rushed to the bathroom. Minutes later, a strong smell of sulfur impregnated the entire casino and then there was an explosion. The entire casino was engulfed in flames, and soon the surviving guests started to spread the word that that strange being had been the devil himself. Nobody knew what happened to the beautiful girl, so most assumed the devil had taken her with him. Only some building walls remained after that disaster, which can still be seen from the city. Some say that witchcraft rituals are performed in those ruins, but nobody knows for sure since nobody dares to go there, out of fear that the devil may reappear. What do you think? Is this legend true? Let us know in the comments.
A 3-story hotel. It was never full, but never empty. Its rooms were not luxurious, and it did not have the best location. In fact, it was right next to a national highway. That was good for business travelers, but terrible for leisure travelers. They kept hearing cars passing by all night long. I chose it for the food. That was the only thing that stood out about the place. All the Google reviews agreed that they offered homemade food at a very affordable price. And to tell the truth, I was also attracted to the price. It wasn't too expensive for being next to the city. I needed to spend a few days in the area because I was writing my new book and I wanted to go to different places to get out of my comfort zone so the ideas would come to me. It usually worked for me, but I had been sleeping badly for months, so I wasn't sure it would this time. I caught a plane and then a cab. There was no other way to get to the hotel. It was clear that it was geared to clients arriving by road, otherwise it was impossible to stay there. As soon as I got out of the cab, I was surprised at how beautiful the exterior facade was. It was spotless and lacked no detail. There were flowers adorning every corner, and the windows were spotlessly clean. I didn't expect that. I thought I would find a typical roadside bar, useful but improvable. I went in happy for what I had found outside and went to the reception. There was a young woman there who, according to my calculations, was not much older than 18. She was perfectly uniformed, and at first spoke to me in perfect English. I told her I was from Spain, and she quickly switched languages, apologizing. After recording my details, she escorted me to my room. I was quite surprised with what I was seeing. I didn't understand why people didn't leave better reviews for that place, because apparently it was very good. That made me curious. It was clear that I was missing something. I went up to my room and decided to rest for a while. The trip had been long, and I needed to clear my mind to write. It was still noon, so I had time to get to know the place. I tried not to let too much light through the window and lay down on the bed. I really shouldn't have been aware of how tired I was. I woke up at 8 o'clock in the evening. It was already dark outside and I was very hungry. I was actually quite groggy. Sleeping so many hours during the day was rare for me, but I took a shower and ran downstairs to the dining room. To my surprise, there was no one there. I was all alone in a huge room with stone walls. The same receptionist who had served me in the morning brought me a small laminated sheet where I could read the menu. I wanted to try everything, but I was going to stay 2 weeks, and I didn't want to bore the food. So I opted for the pasta carbonara. I was so hungry that I needed something hearty, something that would satisfy me. And the truth is that it did. It was a very generous portion, and it was absolutely delicious. Maybe it was because of hunger, but at that moment I thought it was the best pasta I'd ever eaten in my life. I was offered dessert, but I'm not much of a sweet tooth, so I declined. I simply ordered a tea and just sat there watching. I was again surprised that no one else came into the dining room. It was dinner time, and I knew there were more guests. The receptionist came back from time to time to ask me if I needed anything. I saw absolutely no one. I decided to go out to the back garden. I would take advantage of the fact that it was still early to read. There were more people there. Everyone was engrossed in their books, cell phone, or headphones, so I didn't exchange a single word with them. But I did notice that when I saw myself leaving the dining room, they all looked at me. I thought it was simply because I was new. I immersed myself in my reading and lost track of time. 2 hours later, the lights went out in the garden. I understood that it was time for each guest to go to their room, so without thinking too much, I took the elevator to the 3rd floor. Through the corridors, I saw quite a few people, and that reminded me again that the dining room was empty. I made my own mental note to check the prices of the food, so I wouldn't spend my paycheck just to eat. I brushed my teeth and got into bed, but after sleeping all afternoon, I knew I wasn't going to fall asleep that quickly. I grabbed my book again and plunged back into the world of the main character, Sarah. I stayed like that until I heard some strange noises in the next room. They were quite loud thumps, as if they were throwing furniture on the floor. I thought it was a couple having a heated argument, only to make up later. But suddenly I heard the door open, and the noises stopped. There were footsteps in the hallway and nothing else. How I missed having a peephole in the door. Around 4 a.m. I fell asleep. The next day, the dining room looked like something else. There were 8 of us guests, and everyone was having breakfast happily. 2 of them came up to me. "Hi, how are you? Are you new?" I told them yes, and they told me they had also just arrived. Luis had separated from his wife and needed a few days away from everything. He didn't have money to pay for a spiritual retreat, but since the hotel had a garden and a forest in the back, it suited him. Mario, on the other hand, was a publicist and was on his way from one congress to another. He was going to work from there. We spent a long time chatting about our things, and then I went to my room to write. The creative life, although it may not seem like it, also needs a schedule. We agreed to meet at lunchtime, and that made me quite happy. It's always good to eat together. The morning flew by. I decided on several important points in my new novel. I usually write mystery prose, but to tell the truth, maintaining that thread of tension is very complicated, so sometimes I need moments of disconnection. At the appointed time, I went down to the dining room. My 2 new friends were waiting for me at the table. There was only one other person there. After greeting them, I told them that I was surprised that there were so few people in the dining room when the food was so good. Mario said that the night before, he had seen a man eating a sandwich in the hallway. The 3 of us agreed that maybe they couldn't afford that much. Still, I kept thinking. The receptionist, who was as spotless as the first day, left us the menu and added that there were several dishes with the house specialty, mushrooms. I had no idea that was the specialty, but I hated them with all my might. My parents used to give them to me when I was little, until they discovered that they were bad for me, and I was able to get rid of them. I ordered a salad and a veal steak. Mario had rice with seafood, and Louise went for the mushrooms. He said they were delicious, but just looking at them made me sick. Before we left, the receptionist came back to our table. She asked Louise which room he was in. Apparently, there were some glitches in his registration. The afternoon passed normally. After writing for a couple of hours, I met the guys for a walk around. Louise was feeling a bit under the weather. He said the nap had left him groggy, but he was still encouraged to walk around in the fresh air for a while. We wandered into the woods out back and discovered a large greenhouse. We wanted to look around to see what they were planting, but it was hermetically sealed on all sides. We only saw a couple of workers, but when we greeted them, they didn't even answer us. They lowered their heads and continued on their way. We laughed at their sassiness and kept walking. The surroundings were truly beautiful. There were trees of all species and lots of vegetation. We also saw a kind of shed. It was locked with padlocks and the windows had bars on them. In addition, a little before the entrance, there was a sign prohibiting anyone outside the company from entering. What company? I asked myself. As a writer, all these mysterious things aroused in me a great curiosity. But I didn't say anything. I didn't want my new friends to think I was crazy. I shut my mouth and we continued walking. Louise was already feeling much better. The walk had been great for him. We returned just in time for dinner. We entered the dining room, but not before crossing paths with a couple of people who looked at us strangely. Now it wasn't just me who was surprised. My colleagues commented on it as well. People were surprised that we were using the hotel dining room so much. What was the point of that? We sat down, and again the receptionist brought us the menu. To tell the truth, I already knew it by heart. She insisted that we could sit separately if we wanted, but all three of us agreed that we preferred to eat together. Louise was offered a sautéed mushroom dish and asked us if we would like to try it this time. Mario said yes, but he wanted a tiny portion just to taste them. I continued with my disgust for those plants and asked for a fish soup. This time the receptionist wanted to check Mario's room. I fell asleep very early that night. I was awakened by a loud knock on the door at about 2 in the morning. It was Louise, who felt sick and wanted to know if I had any medicine for my stomach. He looked terrible, but I didn't have any. I rarely got sick, and when I did, it was usually a sore throat. He told me he would try to find someone around the hotel, and I offered to go get help instead. When I came downstairs, the receptionist was in her chair. This girl ever sleep? I went over, giving her a good scare, and told her what was going on. She told me that they had a doctor on staff and would send him to Louise's room right away. I was very surprised that they had a doctor on staff. Not even in the big resorts did they have one. I went upstairs and told Louise that the doctor would be right there. I went back to my room and immediately fell asleep. That night I had nightmares about the greenhouse we'd seen in the afternoon. I woke up with a strange feeling. I usually have good instincts, and they didn't fail me that day either. I went down to breakfast very early. Mario was there, as always eager to have his first coffee of the day. We waited a long time for Louise to come down, but he didn't show up. I was quite worried, so I asked the receptionist if she knew anything. She told me that Louise was resting, as the doctor had recommended. It made perfect sense, so I went on with my day. The mornings were being quite productive in that place. I was making good progress on my novel, but that day, I was distracted. I couldn't stop thinking about the mysteriousness of the place. I told Mario that I preferred to walk alone that afternoon, that I needed to find inspiration for one of my chapters. We arranged to meet for dinner, and I left just before lunch. I wasn't hungry, so I thought I'd go to a supermarket and have a snack. After shopping, I went back to the back of the hotel. Everything was the same as the last time we walked there. There was no way to see what they were planting, not even a small hole in the tarp. I passed a worker who again looked away from me, but this time I insisted. "Excuse me, do you know what they plant here?" He turned and said, "You wouldn't want to know," and went on his way. His face was totally haggard, pale, and with a lot of dark circles under his eyes. I then approached the shed and accessed the back. I tried to see through the window what was inside, but I could see only black tarpaulins. They were covering some piles of dirt. Nothing looked suspicious. I decided to leave and come back at night. There were things that didn't add up, and after what the operator had told me, I needed answers. When I came back, I met Mario at the entrance. He had heard strange noises in Louise's room. That's why he had knocked on the door, but no one opened it. Later, he saw the cleaners enter his room, which now had the door wide open. No one was there. Louise would not have left without saying goodbye, so I quickly went down to reception. The young lady very kindly told me that indeed the guest in 302 had gone home to recuperate fully. She asked him to give us his regards just like that. That sounded very strange to me. And to top it off, now it was Mario who was unwell. I asked him what he had eaten, and he told me ravioli stuffed with mushrooms. Then it all made sense to me. Maybe they were using the wrong mushrooms. But were they doing it on purpose? If they were causing indigestion among the guests, surely they had already thought about it. I still had several days left, so I would keep an eye on things. In any case, I told Mario not to eat any more mushrooms. He answered, "What are you talking about, man? They're delicious." That night, as I had planned, I went back down. I grabbed my Swiss Army knife and went first to the greenhouse. I was convinced to cut the tarp to see what was hidden inside, but something caught my eye. 2 workers were wheeling a wheelbarrow toward the shed. They opened the door and went inside. I didn't know whether to follow them or to go ahead with my plan, and in the end, I opted for the second option. I thought that if they were distracted there, they would not notice my presence. I managed to gain access to the greenhouse, and then I could read a label. Amanita phalloides. What was that? I had no idea, but I wrote it down in my notebook and ran out of there. I hid under some bushes and waited to see if the workers would come out, but nothing. There was light in there, and for the 2 hours I was hiding, nobody came out of the shed. What could they be doing for so long? The situation became an obsession. My instinct told me that something strange was going on, but there was little else I could do at that moment, so I went back to my room. I turned on the computer and Googled Amanita phalloides, and then I understood everything. It's a very poisonous mushroom species, although similar in appearance to other edible mushrooms. They were poisoning people. I couldn't wait and ran to Mario's room. I knocked on the door several times, but no one would open it. I was completely desperate. I didn't want anything bad to happen to him, so I decided to go down to the kitchen. I was lucky that the receptionist was not in her place, so I got through without any problems. The kitchen was also deserted, and I didn't find anything strange. What could I do with that information? Should I call the police? I decided to wait for the next day and talk to Mario. But the next day, Mario did not show up. Again, the receptionist told me that he had left because he was indisposed. I thought that was absurd, so I ran off in the direction of the shed. The receptionist kept shouting my name and asking me to stop, but I didn't. I reached the entrance, and just then 2 workers were coming out. I pushed them away and lifted one of the tarpaulins. I couldn't believe it. They were Louise and Mario. They were dead and piled up next to other bodies. The receptionist was following me closely, and when she saw me inside, she took a gun out of her pocket. But just at that moment, a police patrol arrived and saved me. One of the operators, seeing what was about to happen, had reported what had happened. He could not carry more dead bodies. Upon inspecting the area, they found the famous hotel cook. She was an old lady, hairless and with many kilos. At the time of the arrest, she was in the greenhouse, fertilizing her mushrooms with human body parts. After many investigations, they concluded that the people in charge of that organization were experimenting with different amounts of poisonous fungus to see how far the bodies would resist. Once they died, they performed a thorough autopsy. In this way, they were creating an even more poisonous fungus, more and more lethal. I didn't finish my novel, but I decided that this story deserved to be told, because I could never think of anything more terrifying than my vacation in a roadside hotel.
Lindsay had had a terrible day. In the middle of her workday at the cafeteria, her boss had called her to talk to her privately. Her continuous distractions and delays in her schedules had exceeded the owner's patience, so she had made a decision to fire her. Lindsay begged her for another chance, but the woman had given her many in the previous months, so she had made her decision definitively and would not change her mind. The young woman returned to her apartment with tears. She had very little money and no family help. Her parents had died in an accident years ago, and she lived alone in the city. She had to find a new job no matter what. When she arrived at the apartment where she lived with another girl, the day didn't get better either. Her partner was showing a girl their home. Lindsay asked her who she was, and her roommate replied that she was a new tenant. New tenant? But if there are only 2 rooms on this floor. Exactly, and your room will become hers. You haven't paid the rent for 6 months, and I'm fed up. This week, you leave the apartment. She had lost her job in her home. She had no way to pay her to avoid being kicked out of her own home. She only had to stay temporarily at her boyfriend's apartment. She stood at the door and rang the bell. Suddenly, a tall, smiling, young, blonde woman opened the door, wearing only one of her boyfriend's shirts. Seconds later, the young man left the room, unable to contain his surprise at having been caught red-handed. But Lindsay, weren't you working? That had to be a joke. It was impossible that everything could go so wrong. She left her boyfriend's apartment crying and sat in a cafeteria. She needed to go away. She didn't want to have to cross paths every day with all the people who had hurt her so much. She was alone. What could she do? She grabbed his mobile phone and wrote a post on her social network showing her anger and need for a job. If any of her contacts knew of a company that needed people, she might still be lucky. Not even 15 minutes had passed when a girl who had been her childhood friend wrote to her. She told her that she knew of a very good job opportunity and, above all, very well paid. She asked her to meet that same afternoon to talk about it in person. Lindsay had nothing to lose, and she would also appreciate being able to spend some time with a friend to let off steam. When her friend Jamie arrived, she was surprised to see her appearance. They hadn't seen each other for many years, and they both came from a very humble neighborhood and families. However, now Jamie was wearing expensive brand name clothes and shoes. Without telling her anything, she could guess that she wasn't doing badly at all financially. Lindsay was eager to know the details about the job her friend knew, and the young woman began to tell her what it was about. First of all, Lindsay, you must promise me that this conversation will be private. My bosses are very secretive about their personal lives, and they seek discretion. The young woman nodded. Well, I'm working for a family that has a very high standard of living. But there is one thing they haven't been able to get, and that is a baby. The wife has a fertility problem, and they are looking for other options. They need a womb for another person to carry the embryo. In exchange, they offer a very generous offer. Her friend told her that if she was willing, her bosses would pay for the trip home and would provide her with accommodation throughout the process. Lindsay was shocked. She didn't know what the job would be about, but she had never imagined anything like this. Offering her body to give a baby to other people was a very serious thing. She asked her for time to think about it. It wasn't a simple decision. Jamie smiled at her and told her that there was no problem, but if she was interested, she recommended that she not take too long to give an answer. She was at the end of her vacation, and in 2 days she would fly back to her boss's house. If she wanted, she could fly together. Lindsay returned to her apartment, and when she arrived, she had all her items in cardboard boxes in the hallway. Her roommate had gone to the trouble of packing all her belongings, leaving her room free for the new tenant. Given the situation, she didn't think twice and sent Jamie a message confirming that she accepted the job. In 2 days, she flew to the city where her friend worked. When they arrived at the house, the young woman couldn't close her mouth in astonishment. The couple who wanted to hire her had a huge mansion. Her friend asked her to wait in the living room while she called her boss. Meanwhile, Lindsay dedicated herself to observing the objects that adorned their luxurious home. When she approached the photo frames, she discovered who the owner of that mansion was, a famous television actress. She had seen dozens of series where she appeared as a protagonist. Shortly, the woman entered. It was Sabrina Johnson. Sabrina greeted her with a big smile and they started talking. Shortly after, Sabrina's husband, Kevin, an important businessman who owns a large multinational, also arrived. The two began to talk to the young woman about their lives and their future baby. The woman pointed out that if Lindsay accepted, she had to sign a confidentiality contract, which would state that when the baby was born, he would be the legal child of the marriage. Without giving her much time to think and hesitate, the couple introduced her to the chef of the house. The young woman was surprised by the high lifestyle they had, since they even had a person hired just to cook for them, a young man who seemed very nice. After that, the couple showed her her room. They let her settle comfortably, and the young woman was left alone with Jamie. Her friend explained that her job was something similar to that of an assistant. She managed certain of Sabrina's businesses and helped her in her day-to-day life. While Lindsay was putting her clothes in the closet, her friend told her that she should give her her cell phone. Lindsay didn't understand why she would be kept uncommunicated. However, Jamie explained that it was part of the confidentiality agreement. While she was the baby's surrogate, she had to maintain the family's privacy. Furthermore, she had practically no friends, no family, no partner. She was alone, so she wouldn't miss her phone. After signing a bunch of documents, Jamie told her that she could ask the cook to prepare something for dinner. The next day, they would begin medical tests for pregnancy. When Lindsay was left alone with James, the cook, she felt a great complicity. The young man asked her several times if she was sure about the big steps she was going to take, and she could only think that she had nowhere to live or with whom. She felt like she didn't have a future if she didn't earn money soon. So she confirmed that she was sure of her decision. While they were talking, she began to hear very loud screams in the background. It was Sabrina and Kevin. They were screaming at each other in an excessive way. She asked the cook if that was normal. Shouldn't they do anything? James remained silent and continued cooking while the screaming didn't stop. The next day, Lindsay began her doctor's appointments. First, many reviews, analyses, and then came all the others. Vitamins, supplements, diet instructions, and an appointment to start in vitro fertilization. The baby would be the couple's biological child, because Sabrina's egg would be used and James' sperm. Therefore, she would only act as a surrogate. The first days, it seemed like she was living a dream. Sabrina treated her as if they were best friends. She invited her to eat out, she took her shopping. She shared all kinds of plans with her. But everything began to change a few days after fertilization. The doctors had recommended they wait several weeks to find out the results. But Sabrina was impatient to find out if the treatment had worked. She told Lindsay to go get a test, and the young woman tried to make her understand that this would not be a real result. The doctors had given them other instructions. But Sabrina wouldn't take no for an answer, and violently grabbed her arm and dragged her to the bathroom and forced her to urinate on the test in front of her. With tears in her eyes, Lindsay did as she was told. But the worst came once the test indicated a negative pregnancy result. Sabrina was beside herself and started insulting her and telling her that she hadn't done things right. She accused her of taking advantage of her trust, and her money. But Sabrina, I've done everything the doctors have recommended. This doesn't always work out the first time, it's not my fault. However, the woman looked at her with contempt and dragged her back to her room, throwing her on the floor. A few weeks later, Lindsay repeated the pregnancy test. Finally, she achieved her goal. She was pregnant. To her surprise, things didn't get better, but rather the rules were expanded for her. Sabrina passed a list of foods to the cook. She wouldn't be allowed to eat anything that was not healthy for the baby. Goodbye to having any candy or sweets. Besides, she couldn't go anywhere except with them or Jamie. At times, she felt like a prisoner. On one of the daily walks that she had to take accompanied by her friend, she confessed that she had doubts about whether the couple was capable of having the baby. Jamie didn't react well to her confession, accusing her that she had to be grateful for the large amount she would be paid for carrying a child in her womb for less than a year. She felt increasingly uncomfortable there, and the couple's marital situation wasn't improving either. Sometimes they were the most passionate lovers, and other times it seemed like they were going to end up killing each other. They argued in a very violent manner, especially when they had both been drinking a lot, throwing objects at each other, and one of them leaving the house for several days. Before the situation got even worse, Lindsay wasn't sure she made the right decision. That child was not hers. She knew that she had no right to decide after having signed the contract. But wasn't she partly to blame if she helped a child to be born in a family with such an unhealthy environment? One day, the fight had been so violent and terrifying that, scared, Lindsay took advantage of the moment in which they were yelling at each other to escape from the house. A fruit and vegetable delivery man had just stopped in front of the house next door. So while the man left some bags inside the neighbor's house, she took the opportunity to hide in the back of the truck, right behind several boxes of vegetables. She remained hidden long enough, and when she considered she was quite far from home, she came out of hiding and asked the delivery man to take her to a police station. She would tell everything. While waiting in the waiting room to be seen by an agent, she watched the news on television. Suddenly, her photo appeared on the screen. Sabrina and Kevin reported her disappearance and kidnapping of their son. They showed the pregnancy contract they had and accused her of fraud. She couldn't believe it. She had to get out of there. When she tried to escape, a police officer prevented her from leaving. They had registered her arrival and had notified the family that she was at the police station. Shortly after, Sabrina arrived at the office and asked the agents to take Lindsay home again, stating that it all had been a misunderstanding. Immediately afterwards, she took out a wad of bills from her purse and handed them to the police officers, who were guarding the young woman at the police station. When they arrived home, the woman accused her of having taken advantage of her and her husband's kindness and generosity, and she assured her that things would change from then on. She would no longer live in the same house and would enjoy the luxuries that until now were allowed to her. They would lock her in a windowless room in the pool house, where there was only a bed and darkness. And there she would stay all day, except for the mandatory daily walk for the baby's sake. On one of those walks, which she always had to take with Jamie, she asked her to help her. But the one who had been her friend had also betrayed her, siding with Sabrina and her husband. Lindsay couldn't believe she was so blind or so bribed by money to not help her. That couple were a couple of psychopaths and they were going to end her and the baby. Seeing that her former friend wasn't going to help her, Lindsay ran away again. But this time, she didn't get far. Sabrina and Jamie caught up with her quickly. When the young woman woke up, she was in a different place. She didn't recognize that room. It was wide. She tried to get up, but was suddenly scared to see that her hand was chained to the bed. Shortly after, Sabrina entered the room with tears in her eyes. She told her that Kevin had abandoned her forever. "I'm so sorry, Lindsay. I've tried to fix it, maybe too many times. He always promised me that he would change, and I believed him. I'm sorry that in the end you also found yourself involved in all our discussions. I'm sorry everything is going to be so difficult." Although she knew that Sabrina had also acted very badly in all those situations, the young woman couldn't help but feel sorry for the woman. She had been doubly unhappy with a husband who had not treated her well and dealing with the pain of not having been able to bring her own baby into the world. She grabbed her with the uncuffed hand, telling her that even though it was difficult, she trusted that she would be able to be a good mother. "Too bad we'll never know," Sabrina replied. "If Kevin and I are separated, the pregnancy must end. Remember, it's in the contract. Tomorrow we will go to the doctor." Lindsay started yelling at her that she couldn't do it. She was in the last weeks of pregnancy. That wasn't even legal. She couldn't kill that baby. The next day, Sabrina asked her assistant to pick Lindsay up to go to the medical center where they would terminate the pregnancy. When Jamie entered the room, the pregnant woman implored her to please take her to a hospital. She was bleeding and Sabrina wanted to kill the baby. She approached the door to call her boss and tell her what was happening when suddenly she changed her mind and decided to help the young woman. She removed her handcuffs and secretly took her through the house to try to get out without being seen. She helped her get into the car and they ran to the nearest hospital. When Sabrina heard the sound of the engine, she ran into the room to see what was happening. Her assistant had betrayed her. She had to reach them before it was too late. While driving, Jamie apologized for all the time she hadn't helped her. Sabrina blackmailed her with her mother's health, who had been diagnosed with a very serious illness and required very expensive treatment. The famous actress offered to pay for everything as long as she was her faithful assistant. If she betrayed her, her mother's health would be in danger. Everything she had done had been to help her. Suddenly, they felt a rear bump on the car. It was Sabrina who had caught up with them, causing the car to stop. The woman got out of the car and pointing a gun at her, forced them to get out as well. Lindsay cried, imploring her to think about the baby. "Do you think I care about the baby? I don't care what happens to him. He should disappear. He and you have been a mistake." That's when Lindsay saw it clearly. That baby wasn't Sabrina's. They had used one of her eggs and fertilized it. They didn't have any genetic material from the woman. The baby she was carrying was really hers. Jamie took advantage of the moment to hit her on the arm and throw the weapon to the ground. She managed to pick it up before the woman and pointed it at her, threatening her. "Grab my phone, Lindsay, and call the police and the ambulance. She won't hurt you again." Sometime later, Sabrina was exposed and blamed for several crimes. Meanwhile, Lindsay was having an emergency delivery and met her son, the little boy who had suffered so much to be born and be by his mother's side forever. Lunchtime had arrived at the company where I work, and I was heading to the dining room like every day. I was looking at a yellowish mess on my tray that I didn't know it was egg or potato when someone called my name. "Hey, Becky!" She was Mia, one of my co-workers. It's not that we were soulmates, but she was one of the few people I liked in that company. We always waited for each other on breaks and ate together in the cafeteria. So I turned around and walked away. I headed to their table. Samantha, another of the workers, was sitting next to her. They seemed to be discussing some half-secret topic because they were talking in a low voice, so that the other colleagues couldn't hear their conversation. Of course, I asked them. Mia waved her hands, putting tension on the matter. "Haven't you heard the rumors? Another woman was attacked in the shopping center parking lot." I frowned in confusion. Again? I didn't know there was already more than one victim. After the 2 years that I was hospitalized for health reasons, I was quite far from the media. The two girls looked at each other and then at me in disbelief, as if I had missed the news of the century. "Don't you know? According to what they say, she's the 4th victim in just 2 weeks." Since it still didn't mean anything to me, Mia began to explain. This all started a few weeks ago. The first victim was likely a young woman who was shopping at Walmart. It was almost dark when she left the mall, so there weren't too many people in the parking lot. I think it must have been right at the time of closing, when the supermarket no longer allows entry, but there are still the last customers putting their purchases in the trunk. Or at least, that's what I think. What I didn't know was that that famous criminal was hiding under cars. And all the victims attacked had been women and with a red car. Either they were his goal or a great coincidence. I shifted in my chair and swallowed the food in my mouth with difficulty. My car was also red, and I used to make my purchases at that same Walmart. My partner continued to recount the event, saying that the criminal was waiting under the car while the women calmly made their purchase. Once they arrived with the car full, they left the items in the trunk and then walked to the driver's door. But just when they were about to enter, rush! A hand shot out from under the car and cut both their heels with a knife. After the cut, the women fell to the ground, leaving them completely defenseless. That depraved man could do whatever he wanted with them because they couldn't flee. "Oh, I hope he only did it to rob them and not to do anything else to them," Samantha exclaimed as she closed her eyes in anguish. I swallowed hard the next bite in my mouth and asked them how they found out. They quietly confessed to me that the person in charge of Walmart had told them. He was one of the few people who knew, because they didn't want the news to spread throughout the city and spread panic. In the days that followed, the mall killer became the #1 topic of conversation at our company. The rumors spread like wildfire. Everyone knew about him. I heard countless stories of people who knew someone who knew someone who knew someone. And although in my head I had created the idea that it was nothing more than an urban legend that some small group had invented to scare women, I couldn't escape with each new story and each new version of that murderer. Soon, I found myself looking under my car from afar every time I was in a supermarket parking lot. In the end, it happened to me in other places too. One night, I even had to look under the bed before I dared broach her. It was exasperating. I was upset with myself for letting the rumors get to me, even though I knew they weren't true. However, a few days later, I realized how wrong I was. During the last few days, I had avoided Walmart and had done my shopping in other shopping centers farther away. But that day, I decided to skip that nonsense, and since I didn't need much, I drove to my usual supermarket. When I finally left the mall, carrying shopping bags, I was shocked. It was night and everything was dark. In front of me, the parking lot was deserted. It wasn't unusual because it was close to closing time. The shocking thing was that I had lost track of time inside and I didn't know it was so late. With some anguish, I headed to my car. I tried to appear as confident as possible. If there was someone around, I didn't want them to see me as scared. To make matters worse, I noticed that the street lights I had parked under was broken. No matter how hard I tried, all I could see was darkness beneath my car. I felt my pulse quicken. My breathing became heavy with every step I took towards it. But still, I forced myself to walk slowly so as not to show any weakness. With a balancing act I could probably use at a circus, I somehow managed to get the car remote out of my bag, even though my arms were full. Although normally in these situations I close my eyes and run away, I kept creating stories in my head and imagining arms coming out from under the car. With a trembling hand, I pressed the button on the car remote. The trunk was open, but I still wasn't safe. Not caring if I cursed any delicate purchases, I quickly tossed the bags inside. And without closing the door, I immediately jumped back, putting a safe distance between me and my car. Meanwhile, I could clearly hear my pulse beating in my ears. I slowly crouched on the ground. I was finally able to see the underside of my vehicle. There was no one. An embarrassing laugh left my mouth, and I shook my head as I stood up. There was no one there. Of course not. How could I be so stupid? There was no murderer in the mall. Feeling like my heart was several pounds lighter, I walked back to my trunk and slowly closed it. Then I continued to the driver's door. There, without further ado, I opened the door. I was about to sit down when suddenly a scream echoed through the parking lot. I was frozen. That was the voice of a woman. She screamed shrilly until suddenly something drowned out her screams. For a few seconds that seemed like minutes, I began to weigh all kinds of possibilities, trying to choose the best one, without coming out wrong. What should I do? Should I escape and get to safety, or should I see what's going on? Help the woman? I closed my eyes for a few more seconds, even though I had already made a decision. The muffled screams came from another part of the parking lot. I had to turn a corner to see him. There, I saw a figure crouching on the ground next to one of the cars. When he noticed my footsteps, he raised his head, jumped up, and ran in the opposite direction. Almost immediately, the screams became louder again. "Help! Help me!" screamed the terrified woman who was lying on the ground where the figure had just crouched. I ran to her and asked what had happened to her, but she didn't have to answer. I knew as soon as I saw the blood on her feet. The man had cut her heels. The mall killer was real. And who knows what he would have done to the woman if I hadn't been there. Panicked that he might do something to me, I ran out of there. Not before having called the emergency services and telling them what happened. That situation had made me very nervous and had removed my past traumas. I tried to breathe slowly several times and remember the advice I had been given at the center during my recovery. Everything was fine. I had gotten rid of that murderer and I had to celebrate, so I went to release tension with my favorite hobby. After feeling more relieved, I headed to a bar for a drink. That situation had left me with a dry throat. Finally, I found a place. A dark, gloomy place, but also deserted. The waiter was completely alone at one end, watching a football game. I sat at the bar and placed the bag I had with me next to me. I ordered a soft drink. Before the owner had a chance to return to his game, another customer walked in. "Give me a double whiskey." The customer was a thin, long-haired man in his 40s, with wrinkles and dirty clothes. He was wearing a coat and a bag, black, bulky, very similar to mine. As I watched him, he carefully placed it on the adjacent stool and reached for his glass. He threw his head back and swallowed. I could see the movement of his whitish neck. Then he pushed the empty glass away while he asked the owner for another glass of whiskey and took out a handful of bills from his pocket. The waiter's expression was a mix of grimace and smile, but when he saw the bills raining down on the bar, he smiled. He shrugged his shoulders and refilled the glass with alcohol. I knew what he was thinking. If he asked me for beer, I'd tell him to go to hell, but he's paying for whiskey, so hold on. The second glass came down almost as quickly as the first, and he ordered a third. The waiter came back, served him, grabbed the money, and put it in the cash register. I watched the third glass disappear. The stranger's neck was now bright red. 3 glasses of whiskey in 2 minutes also made him lose his tongue, and he began to grumble and start a conversation with me. "Always the same football. God, what kind of hobby is that? Who can be entertained by watching a group of monkeys fighting to kick a ball?" I answered that it was a hobby, but that we were all different. We each had different ways of entertaining ourselves. Maybe he understood me, maybe he didn't, but he nodded his head. Then he asked me what I thought about hunting and fishing. I told him I had no opinion about it. He laughed and joined the conversation. He told me that it was one of his favorite hobbies, although for many it had become just another form of murder, taking a gun and killing an animal, or putting a hook in a fish and making it suffer, for the simple fact of enjoying the hobby of fishing and throwing it back into the sea. I was interested in his reasoning and asked him if killing was justified if it created pleasure in the person. He looked at his empty glass and told me it depended on who. If you made someone who no one would miss without family, like a beggar, it wasn't right, but the person could do it without anyone noticing. No one would miss him and no one would put the city on alarm. I leaned forward and looking at him intently, I asked, "And do you think someone could do something like that?" He didn't look at me, just looked at his bag before answering. "Well, I was thinking about a criminal who used to do it, here in the city too. But that was about 2 years ago. Nothing has been heard from him again." I asked him if he knew who he was, and he said no, that no one knew him. And that was a good thing. That's why he had always gotten away. The police had gone crazy trying to find him. They assumed he was someone from the city, but those were just assumptions. They never had the slightest clue as to his whereabouts. The criminal found some unfortunate person or lured a homeless person into an alley. He promised to give them a bottle of something, and then he cut off their heads. I stood up and reached for the bag. The man laughed and told me not to be afraid. He was sure that the guy was no longer in town. He had gotten tired of the area, or maybe they were about to catch him, and decided to walk away. Afterwards, he came very close to me, so much so that I felt threatened, and he told me, "People have the right to have hobbies, don't you think?" I opened my mouth to answer him, but before I could do so, I heard another noise, the hum of a siren on the street. The man at the bar raised his head. The three of us had realized that they were coming there. The man jumped to his feet and headed for the door. I ran after him and told him, "Hey, don't forget your bag." Without even looking at me, he grabbed the plastic bag and left with a hasty step, getting lost in an alley between two nearby buildings. In a moment, he disappeared. I stood at the door of the bar as the siren sounded closer and closer, making my ears hurt. A patrol car stopped in front of me and another behind me, but neither of them stopped the engine. Two police officers got out and looked at all sides of the road. Inside the bar, they looked at me. Then they asked me if I had seen a man who looked unkempt, thin, with long hair and dirty. I had to tell him the truth, of course. "Yeah, he left here a minute ago." They asked me which direction, and I pointed between the two buildings. One of the police officers gave orders to the two patrol cars, and they started and headed to the direction I indicated. The other two police officers stayed in the bar asking us questions. One of them was the sergeant. They escorted me inside and told me it was the mole killer. Some companions had followed him secretly without uniform to go unnoticed. I took a deep breath, letting the police officers hear it. I told them I had talked to him while I was drinking my soda, but I had no idea he was a criminal. One of the police officers looked at my bag and remembered that the notice was that the murderer also had one with him. The sergeant asked me if I had noticed if he had taken it or left it there. I nodded to him that he had taken his bag with him. A few minutes later, the police officer's walkie rang. They were his companions who had managed to catch the criminal.
Enemy down!
Unfortunately, in the struggle to capture him, he had been injured by one of the police officers while protecting himself, and the criminal had died. The sergeant snorted. That was a big problem, and he would have to give a lot of explanations to the judge. But finally, all those crimes in the city were over. Shortly after, another police officer entered with the bag. The sergeant took it from his hands and placed it on the bar. "Was this the one he had?" he asked me. I nodded, feeling like my voice was sticking in my throat. I turned around. I didn't want to see how the sergeant opened the bag, nor did I want to see their faces when they looked inside. But naturally, I heard them. I think two of them got dizzy. There was a human head. I gave the sergeant my official statement as he requested. They took note of everything and made me sign. I told him about the conversation with a stranger. The whole theory of murder as a hobby, the idea of choosing unfortunate people as victims because no one would miss them. I told him that I didn't think he was being serious. It was just the ramblings of a person who had gone too far with alcohol. The sergeant replied, "He was probably telling you the way a murderer's mind works. 2 years ago, several murderers emerged, but then he stopped killing. I think he left town when things got tough. Then he felt the need to start over. and everything agrees that it was him. That murderer and the one from the shopping center were the same person. I imagine he noticed my expression because he rested his hand on my shoulder. Forgive me, I understand how you feel. You are in great danger talking to him. You've probably been with the smartest psychopathic killer who ever lived. Consider yourself lucky. I nodded and headed to the door. I agreed with the sergeant about the risk taken and about the most intelligent of the psychopathic murderers in the world. Well, more like murderer. I also agreed how lucky I was. I mean, when, at the last moment, the mole criminal ran away from the tavern, and I made the switch and handed him my bag with the head I had just cut off. It was lucky for me that he could never notice that I had exchanged my bag for his. Everyone attributed my crimes to him. Now I must stop again for a while. I must not raise suspicions.
It all started when Marcus found out that he had a serious degenerative disease. Little by little, his strength in his body would be consumed, so he was forced to choose between a distant and painful death or an early death without suffering. Jack was his friend, but also a doctor. He took care of Marcus at all times, trying to make his life as pleasant and comfortable as possible. Knowing his friend's intentions to stop suffering, he made a trip to the West Indies to study some native methods of healing. There, he learned certain practices quite far from modern medicine. Prohibited articles on monstrous surgical experiments, animal transplants in humans, brain modification, and many more studies unauthorized by the medicine of his country. 4 months later, Jack returned from his trip. His friend was anxious to see him again. Marcus's health condition had deteriorated a lot, and he was admitted to a hospital. The doctor explained to his friend the plan he had for him. In his trip, he had found a substance that produced a deep sleep to the one who took it. A near-death state was achieved, muscles relaxed completely, and even breathing and heartbeat ceased while the effects lasted. Jack assured him that he had seen the effects on several natives, and the results were amazing. Many had been cured of terminal illnesses, but for several days his body would remain so immobile that it would look like a corpse. Becoming visible, a state of rigor mortis. At first, Marcus wasn't too clear about the procedure. He began to feel fear and nausea, but on the other hand, the hope of recovery convinced him to continue. There could be the possibility of being cured, something that all the doctors considered impossible. Jack's plan was to administer a copious amount of the substance and leave his body in a semi-dead state. During that time, the disease would stop attacking him, since his body would be almost completely stopped. And in a few days, the disease would be gone and his body would be resurrected. However, there was a problem. It couldn't be known that the doctor had administered said substance, nor could he hide a semi-corpse in the hospital. That substance was illegal in his country, and if anyone found out, the doctor could go to jail. So, they had to simulate his death. It was a macabre and risky idea, but also the only hope of getting his life back. So, he accepted his proposal. After inoculating the necessary amount of the substance, Marcus would be declared deceased from his illness. He had many symptoms, so a coroner was not called, and the death was not investigated. After his burial, Jack would secretly open his friend's grave and bring him home unharmed. Jack had some doubts. What if he woke up in the grave before his friend rescued him? Although he knew that his condition would not last much longer. The thought of suffocating to death in his own grave tormented him. Fortunately, before he knew it, he had already fallen into a state of semi-paralysis and was immediately seized by a deep, dark sleep. Everything went as Jack had planned, even the plan of the exhumation of the grave. So that there would be no mistakes, they decided to mark the coffin with a number, 333. That way, they would know at all times that it was Marcus's coffin. In the cemetery, he left everything as it was. No one would ever find out that a body was missing there. The undertaker was an old friend of the doctor. He helped him with everything and would never reveal his macabre secret. A week later, Marcus woke up at Jack's house. His body was still paralyzed. He could only move his head weakly. However, all his senses were alert. He couldn't believe it. The plan had worked and he didn't feel any pain. A few days later, he was able to eat solid food, indicating that his body was slowly recovering. Jack was very interested in discussing all of his daily symptoms, always asking him if he was feeling anything special. With each passing day, he was getting better, but he still felt the effects of the paralysis. It seemed that his body was anesthetized. It was a strange feeling, since he had stopped suffering, because he felt no pain, and his mind worked normally. However, his body was still asleep. It was as if he had become quadriplegic. The doctor explained that the first resuscitation process had been carried out, but he didn't know exactly when the paralysis of the body would end. Marcus was beginning to feel strange with his friend. It seemed to him that he had paid more attention to his reactions and stimuli than to his own healing. Sometimes he could see a strange gleam in his eyes as he examined him, a kind of victorious flash of having brought him to life after death. The man continued to wait each day with sorrow for the return of his bodily functions. The doctor assured him that it was not long, and that he would enjoy an existence that few men had experienced. The following days, Marcus noticed his friend more and more distant. He felt that he was treating him only as an experiment. He often told him about his new jobs with transplants and cruel treatment of animals in the laboratory that made him shudder. Marcus still hadn't been able to see his body in its entirety since he had woken up, but with his sense of touch returning, he discovered that it had various forms that were unfamiliar to him. He gradually regained mobility in his hands and arms. However, he found it very difficult to get his limbs to obey the orders of his brain. He was totally taken aback. His hands had become clumsy. He had to perform a movement several times to get it done correctly. One day, he asked his friend if he could help him get up and sit on the bed. He felt strong enough to try. His legs seemed to have regained some strength, and he wanted to see how far he could go. At first, the doctor objected, but finally agreed. He advised him to cover himself well with the sheets so as not to be cold, which surprised Marcus. The temperature in the room was nice, but maybe it had something to do with the rehab. The man slowly sat up in bed. At that moment, Jack's face lit up. But Marcus felt as if his arms and legs were refusing to obey his commands. It scared him to be condemned the rest of his days to an absence of sensations. Before, he felt terrible pain, but now he was unable to feel anything. At night, his dreams also haunted him. He would wake up screaming horribly from his nightmares. He dreamed of corpses, cemeteries, lost souls, and macabre events. And meanwhile, in another room, Jack continued with his experiments without flinching, which made him pissed off. After several days of thinking about it, he decided to carry out a plan. He wanted to get out of there. When night came in the gloom, he managed to sit up and put his feet on the ground. The vertigo made him fall onto the mattress instantly. After a few minutes, he tried to get to his feet again, holding on to the bed. The feeling of disobedience in his legs made it much more difficult for him to walk. But little by little, with a candlestick in hand, he managed to reach the corridor of the house. He was heading for the exit, but as he passed the door to his friend's lab, he couldn't help but be curious about what was there. When he entered, what he saw terrified him. Animals, fetuses, bottles with liquids. It seemed to be inside a horror movie. In one corner, Jack was sleeping with his head on his desk and a bottle of alcohol clutched in his hand. For a time, Marcus stood motionless before the scene, afraid that Jack would wake up, but then taking a step forward, he hit his head with the candlestick. The crack was followed by a jet of blood that fell from the table to the floor. But Marcus felt no remorse for killing his friend. He looked at all the specimens that were scattered around the room in various states of preservation. Jack had shown no mercy to them. He had gone too far in his experiments to deserve to continue living. And Marcus considered it his duty to do justice. He left the lab and staggered to the stairs that led down to the front door. He stumbled downstairs and reached the ground floor. He was still having a hard time keeping himself steady, so he grabbed an umbrella at the entrance and used it as a cane. He left the house and went to the cemetery where he had been buried. He approached his own grave, and he had a strange feeling. He began to scratch at the damp earth until his fingers tripped over the coffin. His fingers were bloody, but he felt no pain. The casket had the number 333 embossed on it. He tried to open the lid when a foul smell made him back down. Was there another dead man buried in his grave? Suddenly, the putrid smell became a familiar smell, horribly familiar. What had he become? He took off his pajamas, first his shirt and then his pants. He found himself with very hairy arms, too hairy to be human, and horrible legs, short and totally unknown to him. He had the body of a true monster. Jack had used him to accomplish his purposes. His body overturned any natural law of the human body. Marcus wanted to disappear, He didn't want to live that way. He understood why his friend always warned him to cover himself with the blankets, and he also understood why his body didn't obey him. Jack had treated him like another experiment. He was the result that artificial life could be possible. It had become his work of art. He grabbed the lid of the coffin again and opened it. He could see his own headless body was intact.
Welcome, horror lovers. We bet you've heard many scary legends about abandoned buildings inhabited by ghosts of the past. Many of these end up being demolished, while others, like the building today's protagonist was in, are renovated and open once more their terrifying doors. A lot of time had passed, and Rose still couldn't find a job as a nurse. It was pretty difficult due to her lack of education and experience. And every year, things would get more and more complicated. She was about 40 years old and was a careful and competent professional, but always had in front of her either young women with scholarships looking to start their training, or veterans who were way more skilled than her. She started to give up and stay at home, feeling depressed. Her husband Jack also felt terrible due to her situation. Fortunately, he had a stable job in IT, and even though they could both live with his income, he knew this situation was torture for her. Rose could end up developing a disorder, or even worse, wandering around like a soul in torment. Being a nurse, and especially taking care of others, had been her dream since she was young. One day, Jack had a bit of a strange idea, which he had to try now as a last resort. He heard that the old mental home at the city outskirts had been renovated. A while ago, they used to receive the most severe cases of schizophrenia and psychosis, but had to close it down due to lack of resources. However, they had renovated it into a modern hospital with the latest technology ready to open again. He went to the management office with Rose to make them an extraordinary proposal. She would work there for free for the first 3 months, and if she managed to prove her value as a nurse, they would hire her full-time. And if she didn't, she would simply leave without saying a word. Rose was very surprised, but thought the idea wasn't bad at all. Quite the contrary. She preferred to help others instead of staying at home doing nothing, even if she wasn't paid for now. And thus, that's how she could finally get a job as a nurse, and in one of the most prestigious medical centers of the region. The entire complex had 5 floors, but only 4 were currently functioning. The 3rd floor was still under construction and still conserved some remains of its sinister past. When Rose was on call, she would sometimes walk around there, feeling strangely attracted to the rooms in ruins, with cushioned walls and beds with straps. Weeks passed by and she started to feel very hopeful, and soon enough, the management team told her how satisfied they were with her work, as well as the patients. They were so happy with her that they finally decided to hire her permanently and would even pay her for the month she had already worked in there, and she deserved it. The renovations on the 3rd floor were almost complete. It would start being used soon and the hospital needed more stuff. That was when, in the middle of a night when she was on call, she heard how she was called over the loudspeakers. She had to clean a mess on one of the rooms in the 3rd floor. That was weird, since that wasn't exactly part of her job and the 3rd floor wasn't in use yet. She couldn't recognize that voice either. It sounded so gruff and deep that she was sure she hadn't heard it before. However, willing to help, she obeyed the voice. When she arrived, it seemed that nobody was on the floor and all the hallways were dark, even though she thought she heard murmurs on the other side. In the dark, she tried to find the light switches, but when she tried to turn them on, there was no electricity. It was also very cold since all the windows were broken. Many times she asked out loud if someone was there, but nobody responded, so she decided to return to her usual position. On her way back, she went to the management office to ask why she was instructed to go there. But the response they gave her left her very perplexed. They told her that nobody had called her. In fact, nobody even heard the loudspeakers. They all seemed to be as puzzled as she was, but then Rose thought that maybe they were just playing a prank on her for being near and tried to just forget about it. It could also be that she heard wrong or that her imagination was playing tricks on her. It was 3 in the morning and she was very tired. Fortunately, she was assigned a new assistant, Jenny, a young woman excited to learn by her side and who soon became her friend. Rose felt safer with Jenny, although Jenny had kind of an eccentric hobby. She liked to talk about urban legends and mysterious cases. Thanks to Jenny, Rose learned the terrifying truth about the old building they were now working in. The former mental home had been closed down due to horrible abuses by the staff on the patients. Some cases were so extreme that the staff would confine the patients for days and would even leave them immobilized in their beds, forgetting about them afterwards. They would even beat the ones who were more hysterical to calm them down or would leave them without food for days. It was a pretty grim picture. The mental home was crowded with patients who would wander the hallways with no supervision while the staff became overwhelmed and lost their humanity. It was a nightmare, one that would fortunately never happen again because the new center now had enough resources, as well as excellent workers such as Rose. And there was Jenny too, who turned out to be the perfect helper. However, one fateful night while Rose and Jenny were having a break together, that sinister voice sounded again through the loudspeakers. It called Rose again, this time to room 33 in the 3rd floor, while sending her partner Jenny to a different place. That was strange because even though the renovation of the floor was finished, it was still unoccupied. Intrigued, Jenny decided to go with Rose. However, when they were halfway there, as if the voice was observing them, it once again ordered Jenny to go somewhere else. And so, Rose had to keep going to room 33, alone. This time around, the hallways were illuminated with a dim light, but there was still nobody inside. She arrived at room 33 and slowly opened the door, as if she didn't want to wake up whoever was inside. And in fact, there was actually a patient there, lying on the bed. However, there were no machines around him and no relative or friend staying with him. Worried about the patient, Rose asked for permission to come in and turned on the light. However, what she saw left her frozen in shock. The walls had a new cushioning as if it had been renovated, but that made no sense since they no longer took care of mental patients in that medical center. There were also a lot of scratches on the cushions as well as bits of blood. She started to get scared, but even then she approached the patient to see if he needed her help. The texture of his skin was a bit strange with a yellowish tone. His eyes were closed, so she tried to call him softly. Since he wasn't responding, she walked towards him, and she suddenly started to experience a strange sensation. She tried to come closer, but with each step, she noticed the patient was getting farther and farther away from her, to the point that she started to get exasperated. She felt panic and wanted to run towards the door. However, when she turned around, she noticed she had never left her initial position. She looked at the patient once again and felt deep pity for him due to his terrible state. And thus, she mustered all the courage she could and with determination tried to reach once again the patient's bed to see what was going on. And this time around, she actually managed to reach it. However, when she looked at the patient, what she saw petrified her in horror. She could barely contain a scream. When she touched the hand of the patient, she noticed that it was completely cold, with no life. She didn't need to take his pulse to know he was dead. And even then, suddenly, the patient reacted and opened its eyes. Rose didn't know if he was looking at her since its eyes were completely black as midnight. However, she could see herself reflected in those eyes. Shocked beyond belief, Rose let go of the hand of that patient and wanted to run back to the door. But it slammed shut on its own, confining her there. Terrorized, she slowly turned around to the bed once more. Now the bed was empty and the bed sheets were scrambled as if the patient had gotten up hastily. She tried to search for him around her, but the darkness of the room barely allowed her to distinguish the corners. She then heard a hoarse and deep whisper coming from a voice she immediately recognized. "You're just like the others. You're going to abandon me here. But now, You will never get out. Meanwhile, going back to her post, Jenny heard a scream coming from the third floor. Fearing for Rose, she rushed to room 33, but when she arrived, she turned on the lights and noticed nothing strange. The walls were smooth, recently painted with an immaculate color, and the modern beds were ready to be used. She searched the entire floor for Rose but couldn't find her, and thus Rose was never seen again. That fateful night, she had disappeared forever. Today, we bring you a fairly old creepypasta, but that not many know. The one about don't go to an old McDonald's. Why? What are they hiding? Stay to know our adaptation of the famous story. Hi everyone! Today I come to talk to you about something that you have been trying to cover up for a long time. And yes, it is about the world-famous Smiling Clown Burger Company. I am sure many of you have been to a current McDonald's, with its new McCafes, entertainment areas. But have you ever questioned why the store has begun to change? In recent years, McDonald's has embarked on the task of renovating all of its restaurants around the world. I'm sure some of you are thinking about how long it's been since you last set foot in an old venue. If you talk to someone who knows about marketing, you will hear something curious. The company has lost a good amount of money on this. The new furniture is not attracting more customers. Those interested argue that they want to create a more adult environment, a more sophisticated image for the classier public. Well, wrong answer. If you Google right now, what is the age group that McDonald's targets? To children and teens, of course. It has always been like this. So why embark on all these reforms? Why does one of the largest fast food corporations invest millions of dollars in such an unsuccessful marketing strategy? That's where the story gets interesting. Let's start with the play areas. If you remember correctly, there were rarely two identical entertainment areas in two McDonald's. Some were very funny, but others were quite dangerous too. The first story I found was about a carousel playground in Lancaster, Pennsylvania in the 80s. The place ended up closing a few months after it opened. Few explanations were given as to the reason for the closure. The place has been for sale since then. If you can contact the right people in Lancaster, you may be able to find an article that was never published. The children played on the carousel as normal. However, one day, several little ones managed to get under it, but they were never able to get out. The entire incident was carefully monitored by McDonald's PR department, so you'd be hard-pressed to find anyone who was there that afternoon. The only witness who spoke said this: when they got under it, some parents started screaming for help. Then something happened to the lights. The carousel got brighter and brighter and the music became deafening. I ran out of the building when the machine started smoking. But I looked out the window again to see if the kids were okay, and the employees were standing there behind the registers. It looked like they were waiting for more customers. Strange stories have emerged from that place over the years. Reports of children sinking into ball pits that should only be a few inches deep. Mothers searching for their children in the tubular structures and finding only their pair of socks. But the play spaces weren't the only places where strange events were recorded. In 1996, in Knoxville, Tennessee, there was a businessman in his 40s who entered the bathrooms of a McDonald's and remained there for 7 long hours. Customers and workers commented that he refused to leave the place. Finally, they called the police and managed to force the door. The emergency services had to restrain him as he wasn't willing to leave the toilet. As they took him out, he began to exclaim, "Take me back! I want to go back!" But the moment he left the restaurant, he collapsed. He had no memory of ever having been to a McDonald's. The restaurant was closed before anyone could inspect the bathroom in which the individual had locked himself. However, some people who had entered claimed to have heard several voices whispering things along the lines of, "It wasn't him. We have to go back. I saw you smile." Then a story circulated that in Vermont in 1990, an employee in charge of the fryer area entered the middle of the restaurant and doused himself with boiling oil. He showed no reaction nor uttered a single word. Some customers started laughing and spinning around with the burning oil, and they all ended up in the hospital. Only one survived, but he refused to comment. Well, he couldn't do it easily either because his throat was melted down to the esophagus and he had to undergo multiple surgeries. The store manager claimed not to remember ever hiring that person as a fryer, and he didn't appear in any official document. He stated that his ID didn't even have a name on it. It just had pound signs written on it. Once again, that old McDonald's was closed without a trace. Most of these stories sounded like urban legends to me. Every time I found a new one, McDonald's closed its doors. As the 2000s progressed, cover-ups became so common that McDonald's decided to tear them all down and rebuild them all. Well, almost all of them, because some were left untouched. I needed to see one in person, to know if it felt like a different energy or if it was just scary stories from the internet. There was a little town in Orozca, near the highway. Maybe 100 people lived there, more or less. Completely cut off from the outside world, it seemed almost forgotten. You would never stop there if you don't live in that town, because there wasn't even a gas station, nor a rest area, nor a sign indicating that you were near that place. I had to do a little research to find where it was, as they had one of the few old McDonald's that still had its original look from the 1970s. I was surprised that there was a fast food restaurant in that area, when there wasn't even a supermarket. I planned a trip with a stop in Orozca. It was already night and we were in the middle of winter, so it was very cold. I doubt I would have found that place before GPS phone existed, because the detour from the main road was a dirt road. No landmarks or anything. When I entered the town, I saw that none of the houses had their lights on. Even most of the streetlights were off, as if no one had remembered how to change the bulbs for years. It was as if that place had been frozen in time. I would be surprised if most of the residents hadn't moved away or even passed away. It certainly had all the signs of a ghost town. I was about to give up hope when I finally saw it. The yellow light from the golden arches illuminated an empty parking lot in the distance. It hummed and flickered like an electric fly swatter with dead batteries. The sign up ahead said, "Try the new Egg McMuffin. We love seeing you smile." I parked my car in the center of the parking lot without thinking too much about it, because there was no one else there anyway. When I got out of the car, I noticed something sticky under my foot. There was a burger covered in mold and a dark liquid coming out of it. The smell was absolutely vomiting. I jumped to brush the remains of the burger off my shoe, but then I realized the entire parking lot was full of trash. There were boxes of half-eaten French fries and children's toys melted by the sun and soaked with grease from McDonald's bags. Everything was a mixture of dirt and snow, as if it had been there for months, maybe years. I hurried across the parking lot, trying to stave off the nausea that threatened to overtake me. As I approached the door, I saw that the windows were covered in dust. Someone had taped a piece of paper to the glass with the word "closed" scrawled in red marker. However, the sign hanging from inside clearly indicated that it was open. I approached the door cautiously and pushed it open. An artificial bell played, an old McDonald's tune that faltered in the last few notes as the door creaked. I looked around the room lit by fluorescent lights and realized that everything was empty. There was no one sitting at the tables or behind the counters. Someone had left a tray on one of the tables at the back, but there was no other sign that anyone had been there. The toys on display near the counter were of characters I had never heard of. Surely they were from a time before I was born. The entire place was covered in layers of faded paint in shades of yellow and red, and the tables had that wood finish so characteristic of a McDonald's. The wood appeared to be completely eaten away, but had been covered with layers of enamel in a sad attempt to maintain its original appearance. It all had a sort of greenish hue that I attributed to the old lights. However, what stood out the most, in my opinion, was an unpleasant burnt plastic smell that stung my nose. I approached the counter. As if there was someone present, I felt like I should make a request, although I also hoped I could ask some questions if there was someone to ask. I remained silent for about 15 minutes. I even shouted a hello, but only got a quiet echo in response. I had experienced bad service at some McDonald's in the past, but this was completely absurd. The place was very dirty, so I wasn't going to wait long. Just as I was about to turn around and give up, the cash register opened. It was almost like it was begging me to grab some money for myself. Besides, didn't I deserve a little reward for wasting my time? I crept closer and saw at least a dozen bills stacked up. I looked around to make sure I wasn't being watched. I bent down to grab some money, and in that instant, the box slammed shut on my fingers. The metal dug deep into my skin, leaving a dark trail of blood along the edge. I screamed in pain. At the other end of the counter, a first aid kit hung on the wall. The lights in the kitchen area were out, but I urgently needed a bandage. I jumped over the bar and headed towards the back. The burning smell became more intense as I went. I noticed that the grill was covered in a thick layer of grease, completely unusable. I passed by the fryer area and one of them was full of worms. I quickened my pace to get to the first aid kit, hoping to get a bandage and get out of there as quickly as possible. I was beginning to realize that this restaurant was definitely not in business and that maybe I shouldn't have gone in. I opened the first aid box and had to force myself to contain the vomit. A cloud of mold billowed in all directions when I opened it, accompanied by the same black substance I had seen on the burger I'd stepped on outside. I started coughing and waved my hands in the air to disperse the mold particles floating around me. The same bell that had rung upon entering, the one playing the McDonald's tune, began ringing again, forcing me to calm down. I assumed it was broken, like everything else in this disastrous place. I looked back at the counter and noticed that everything seemed more distant. I was probably disoriented due to the loss of blood and that unbearable smell. I looked down at my hand to examine the cut and my eyes widened. There was no injury. I started to run in panic towards the counter, but I tripped on something and fell. In the gloom, my eyes began to adjust and I made out the silhouette of a body. Someone was there underneath. Could it be that someone was unconscious and needed help? I pulled on his arm and a half-decomposed body slid across the floor. He was wearing a McDonald's uniform shirt and a padded tag in place of his name. His mouth was deformed, creating a sickly smile, but his eyes reflected desperation. I tried to scream, but no sound came out, like when you struggle to wake up from a nightmare. As I tried to stand up and approach the counter, the lights began to go out and the McDonald's tune grew louder and louder, the notes becoming high-pitched and distorted as they echoed. When I managed to get over the counter, I was paralyzed with horror. Since I had entered, I hadn't looked towards the opposite side of the restaurant where the games area was located. The glass that separated the restaurant from the children's area was covered with hundreds of bloody footprints sliding downwards. The slide was filled with stains of red liquid that cascaded down. At the bars, there were employee uniforms hanging with the same signs on their labels. The tables were surrounded by skeletons accompanied by rotten food on trays, some pieces of food hanging from their jaws. I watched in horror, so shocked that I found it impossible to move. As the rest of the restaurant fell into darkness, a light bulb in the center of the play area continued to shine like a beacon. Below it, there was a pool full of balls, barely able to contain all those colored plastic balls. From the center light bulb, smoke rose that made the eyes and throat sting, with the nauseating smell of burning plastic. Suddenly, the balls began to shake and fall over the edges, as if something inside them was moving. I wanted to run desperately, but my body refused to obey. Then, abruptly, the music stopped and the movement stopped completely. A yellow glove slowly emerged from the ball pit, its fingers twisted in a sinister dance. A sleeve followed in red and white, colors that slowly alternated as they emerged from below. The arm continued to rise towards the ceiling, higher and higher, and its joints creaked like breaking branches as they revealed themselves. When it was finally entirely visible, I saw that that arm was at least 2 meters long, extending in an exaggerated way. Once it reached the illuminated bulb in the ceiling, with its gloved fingers it began to twist it until it was loose. The room was plunged into darkness. In an instant, I broke into a run, knocking over chairs and jumping over the counter as I hurried to escape. The last light went out just as I reached the exit. I slammed the door, breaking the glass in the process. I rolled out into the parking lot, and in the dead silence, I heard a distant scream followed by a whisper that touched my ear. The whisper had the same distortion as the McDonald's tune. "Come back. I want to see you smile." I haven't told anyone what happened that night. I found an article online a few days later that said Orozca had been consumed by a fire that reduced everything to ashes. I don't know if that was a form of cover-up or something more sinister occurred, but one thing's for sure. I will never go back to find out. In fact, I don't share this with the intention of getting you involved. I do this to warn you about the consequences of doing so. If you decide to visit another new McDonald's and buy a Big Mac or have a drink at the Mac Cafe, you'll be fine. They have taken steps to make those places safe, at least for now. But under no circumstances should you ever think of entering an old McDonald's. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it. And if you want to see more Draw My Life videos, subscribe to our channel. See you in the next episode!